IFCJ, or go online to ifcj.org.
At U Haifa International, academic excellence isn't just a standard, it's a way of life. With 21 English-taught master's programs, world-class faculty, and Israel's top national score in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, students grow in every direction.
If you really want to challenge yourself academically, grow in a very diverse community, and be immersed in such an important and significant environment, University of Haifa is the place for you.
Located on the stunning Carmel Ridge, the U Haifa blends academic excellence with a welcoming community.
U Haifa International has a great combination of top-notch academics with a great community of students.
Whether you're pursuing a one-year master's or diving into research, U Haifa gives you the tools, mentorship, and real-life insight to make your mark on the world. U Haifa International. Master your mind, live your Israel experience.
For more than 200 years, when Israel's most vulnerable needed help, Kol El Chabad was there. When families can't afford food, when seniors are alone, when children are struggling to survive, Kol El Chabad steps in with meals, essentials, and dignity. Right now, thousands of families across Israel are counting on that help, and you can make sure it reaches them. Your donation doesn't just give charity, it gives hope, it gives strength, it saves lives. Kol El Chabad, helping Israel one life at a time. Scan the QR code on your screen and give now. Step into the story of Israel's heartland with Blessed by Israel, where every purchase connects you to the land, the people, and the promise. Taste the sweetness of the promised land in their delicious honeys, or wear the story of the land close to your heart with the stunning Special Places of the Land necklace. Behind each product is a family, pioneers living in Judea and Samaria, crafting beauty and goodness from the soil of the Bible. When you buy their creations, you're not only receiving something extraordinary, you're investing in Israel's future, helping small businesses thrive and communities grow strong. Join a movement that celebrates faith, resilience, and hope. Visit blessedbyisrael.com and use ILTV's special code BLESSISRAEL, that's BLESSISRAEL, at checkout for 10% off on your first order. Be part of strengthening Israel, one purchase at a time.
Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. We're live from Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines of the region. I'm Sivan Raviv, and here is your roundup of the latest developments coming out of Israel. We begin with some breaking news. A combined missile and rocket attack by Iran and Hezbollah has hit northern Israel a short while ago, with at least 10 impact sites reported, including a strike on the Bazin oil refinery in the Haifa area. Several injuries have been reported as emergency teams respond. Meanwhile, in the south, sirens continued after recent Iranian strikes, including a hit near a chemical facility in Beersheba yesterday that caused injuries but no hazardous leak, according to authorities. We now go to our ILTV correspondent, Devo Klein, for the latest updates on the ground.
Hey Sivan, just coming on for a brief update on the incoming situation here in Israel. Now, in the last 2 hours, the north of Israel was subject to a coordinated attack by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the Islamic regime in Iran. Of course, the Islamic regime are sending over their ballistic missiles, and Hezbollah are contributing through their rockets and their mortars and targeting northern Israel. Now, in this latest barrage just 2 hours ago, it was the Haifa Bay area that was targeted, more specifically the Haifa refinery, and we're now hearing that there was a
hit. So this is actually the second time since the war begun that the Haifa refinery has been targeted and hit by the Islamic regime. Thankfully, we're not hearing of any significant damages to this refinery site. And also, personnel have been evacuated adequately, which means that we're also not hearing of any injuries to personnel. But what we are hearing of is at least 10 impact sites across northern Israel as this missile was heading over to the Haifa Bay area. Fragments and shrapnel were falling down on civilian areas. We're hearing of one impact site to a civilian building in Shifra'am, which is in northern Israel, and at least 10 other impact sites. Thankfully, by God's good graces, we're not hearing of any significant injuries to people, although there is extensive damage to property, to cars, to buildings. And this is in the latest bars of the last 2 hours. But of the last 24 hours, Sivan, the north of Israel has been suffering from numerous red alert sirens. We've counted at least 12. Now, 60% of these are actually from UAV infiltrations, that's unmanned aerial vehicles. The north of Israel is currently described as the confrontation line. That means that they are right at the border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Now, the IDF are currently working to expand a buffer zone to create, a larger distance between Hezbollah and the citizens of northern Israel, giving them more time to get to their shelters. As of right now, there's barely any time between the red alert siren and the actual impact of the rockets being sent over by Hezbollah. So the IDF are working on it, but as of right now, northern Israel has been an incredible target for both the Islamic regime in Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And thankfully, we're not hearing of any injuries as of now. But it's not just northern Israel, it's also southern Israel that has been targeted in the last 24 hours. We've counted at least 8 red alert sirens in southern Israel. That's the Negev and Beersheba region. One of the more significant impacts, and the videos surfacing online, these huge plumes of smoke, a chemical factory making agricultural products was hit in the barrage yesterday on the Beersheba and the Negev area. Now, Israeli officials are now saying that the potential biohazardous event that could have unfolded from this impact has now been deemed as safe for civilians. So that event has now been closed. And surprisingly, central Israel has not been targeted in the last 24 hours. We have had one alert in the Shvela, the lowlands region, and one in Jerusalem. But this is the latest of the incoming, and that's a wrap.
Thank you, Devo. It's day 31 of the war with Iran, and the campaign is entering a critical phase with close coordination between U.S. Central Command and the IDF. According to reports, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper met in Israel with IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir, with talks focused on the conflict and efforts to halt Iran's weapons production. On the ground, strikes are continuing. Iranian media reports an Israeli strike on a petrochemical facility in Tabriz, while authorities say no hazardous materials were released. At the same time, the IDF says it carried out a wave of extensive strikes in Tehran, targeting dozens of sites linked to Iran's military industry. The targets included a key ballistic missile component facility, one of only 2 in the country, along with missile engine production, drone manufacturing, weapons storage, and air defense development sites. The IDF says the strikes are part of a broader effort to systematically degrade Iran's ability to produce and deploy advanced weapons. Iranian media also reported power outages in parts of Tehran following the attacks. With just 8 days left before President Donald Trump's deadline for Iran to accept a 15-point plan, diplomacy appears stalled. The proposal remains under review in Tehran with no clear sign of a breakthrough. President Trump says a deal is still possible, but warns military options remain on the table. As the deadline approaches, the region is bracing for either a last-minute agreement or further escalation. Let's take a listen to Trump.
We've had very good negotiations today with Iran, getting a lot of the things that they should have given us a long time ago. We'll see how it works out, but they're very good, moving along very nicely. They've destroyed a lot of additional targets today. The Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, we know that. But we destroyed many targets today. It was a big day. And we are negotiating with them directly and indirectly.
Foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey are meeting in Islamabad in a bid to de-escalate the crisis, but there are no signs of direct U.S. or Iranian participation. Here's the Pakistani foreign minister on this.
I briefed the visiting brother foreign ministers on the prospects of potential U.S.-Iran talks in Islamabad. The visiting foreign ministers expressed their fullest support to this initiative. Pakistan will be honored to host and facilitate meaningful talks between the two sides in coming days for a comprehensive and lasting settlement of the ongoing conflict.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the joint U.S.-Israel campaign has yet to force Iran to accept demands on its nuclear program or reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a key global oil route that remains blocked, driving prices sharply higher. With diplomacy stalled, President Trump is now considering a range of military options, including strikes on energy infrastructure and targeted operations inside Iran. Trump has even raised the possibility of targeting Harg Island, Iran's main oil export hub, calling it one of many options. Harg Island is seen as a key strategic target amid the ongoing conflict and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, U.S. forces are building up in the region with thousands of Marines deployed, signaling preparations for possible further action. The White House says no final decision has been made, saying the military buildup is designed to give the president maximum optionality. But with U.S. forces continuing to surge into the region, including Marines and sailors aboard the USS Tripoli, the window for diplomacy appears to be rapidly closing. The IDF announced the death of 19-year-old Sergeant Liran Ben-Zion, who was killed by an anti-tank missile in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is expanding its buffer zone in Lebanon aimed at preventing infiltrations and pushing anti-tank threats away from the border. Netanyahu says the strategy is designed to thwart the threat of invasion, part of a broader shift toward a more proactive security doctrine, including what he described as security belts inside Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. On the ground, the IDF says operations in southern Lebanon are continuing, combining ground maneuvers, airstrikes, and intelligence-led missions targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. Military sources say forces have advanced toward the Litani River, while special units and reservists are carrying out targeted strikes and foiling attacks by armed operatives. Israel says the goal is to create a deeper security perimeter and prevent future attacks. Here's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said.
לבנון, הנחיתי עכשיו להרחיב עוד יותר את רצועת הביטחון הקיימת כדי לסכל סופית את איום הפלישה וכדי להרחיק מגבולנו את ירי טילי הנ"ט. צריך להבין שנסראללה יצר פה כוח גדול, הוא האמין שעם הכוח הזה הוא ישמיד אותנו. טוב, את נסראללה חיסלנו אלפי מחבלים של חיזבאללה, וחיסלנו מעל הכל את האיום העצום של 150,000 טילים ורקטות שנועדו להחריב את ערי ישראל. אבל עדיין יש לחיזבאללה יכולת שיורית לשגר רקטות אלינו. ומה שדנתי היום עם המפקדים כאן, זה בדרכים להסיר גם את האיום הזה. אזרחי ישראל היקרים, אני כמובן לא יכול לשתף אתכם בדיונים הללו, אבל אני כן יכול לומר לכם שאנחנו נחושים לשנות את המצב הזה בצפון מיסודו.
And now the budget. The budget in Israel. The Knesset has approved a record 850 billion shekel wartime budget, the largest in Israel's history, avoiding early elections for now. The measure passed 62 to 55 after a tense late-night session disrupted by missile sirens, with lawmakers voting from a fortified room. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich defended the plan, while opposition leader Yair Lapid sharply criticized it. The budget boosts defense spending, while also allocating billions to social services, including ultra-Orthodox education. For now, the vote secures the government, but deep political divisions remain. As the war with Iran enters a critical phase with escalation on multiple fronts and diplomacy uncertain, we're now joined by Professor Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor and Major in Reserves Elliot Chodov, political and military analyst. Thank you both for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Likewise. We are now more than a month into this war. How close are we to a decisive moment, or are we just entering a longer phase of the conflict? Elliot, what do you think?
I think we're in what I would call the boring phase of the conflict. The Air Force continues to bomb targets in Iran, but most of the targets that are being bombed are long-term strategic. Weapons manufacturing of varying types, meaning that the targets that are being taken out today have no real effect on what's happening today on the ground. They will have an effect on what won't happen into the future. So we're not seeing, how can I put this, the excitement of the opening days of taking out leadership and destroying air defenses and things like that, which are very photogenic even if you don't have the actual photographs descriptively photogenic. Today, it's more the hard work of weakening Iran, but ultimately, as long as the regime remains in power, what's being done is gaining time. In other words, pushing further down the road their recovery, which will happen, and that's just a question of how many years and how much pressure is put on them into the future.
Now, Chuck, we are on day 31, 1 month to this war, and we still don't know if we're heading towards an expansion of the war or the halting of the war. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think expansion, de-escalation, political agreement, in the end, it all boils down to one person, and that is President Trump. What he decides will be what binds Israel as well. We're not an independent actor in this war. Now, I fully agree with what Elliot was saying, the significant military achievements that have been achieved already and the long-term impact that it will have on Iran. But at the same time, I am quite concerned that this was really a once-in-a-lifetime historic opportunity where the United States is leading a war together with us against Iran, where the original objectives were to topple the regime and to put a final end to the nuclear program and the ballistic missile program. And the way things are developing so far, it's quite questionable whether any of those objectives will be achieved. Certainly regime change looks quite unlikely at this point. And if that's the case, then we are in serious danger of ending this war with a military success, but a strategic failure. And that will be a very, very unfortunate outcome if it happens.
Regime change was never one of the declared official goals of the war.
It was. It was. Both the prime minister and the president said it in every possible way that they could have. They then both backed off it pretty quickly when they realized that they weren't going to achieve it. But to say that they didn't state that as objectives, I think that's inaccurate.
Now, Elliot, is regime change even possible from the air? At the moment, we only have airstrikes, right? And maybe possibly in the near future, boots on the ground. But is that even possible? Or do we need the Iranian people to rise?
Well, it has to be the Iranian people. It cannot be done from the air. It could never have been done from the air. The regime is resilient, and we see it. And it's been a resilient regime. It's not a one-man show. As we saw in Syria with Bashar Assad, it's been institutionalized over decades, and simply taking out even the top echelon, the initial strikes, was not going to bring down the regime. The best that could have been hoped for, and I think it's still a possibility, I wouldn't put odds on it, is that when all is said and done, the opposition within Iran will be able to do it. I have a pretty standing iron law about these kind of uprisings, and that is that they succeed when the rebels have more people willing to die than the regime is willing and able to kill. And the regime has shown its willingness to kill untold numbers. The air campaign may reduce their ability to do it and may give the opposition, the rebellion, a chance to succeed. But there are a lot of ifs in that. Ifs having to do with the willingness of the people to do it and their capability to actually overthrow. So once again, I'm not going to put odds on it, but that's how can I put this? The optimal solution and the optimal conclusion of this campaign. Boots on the ground are not going to take over Iran. They'll maybe a raid here or there. They're talking about removing nuclear material, possibly along the shores of the Straits of Hormuz, but we're talking about very, very limited force. If you add together everything that's being sent by the U.S., Marine Amphibious Force, the Rapid Deployment Force, now there are additional reports of commando forces, it doesn't add up to anywhere near an invasion expeditionary force.
No, but it does appear that thousands of Marines have arrived in the region, and apparently more are on their way. Are Are we assuming these will be strategic operations, as you mentioned, Elliot? Chuck, what do you think? Are they going to be trying to take over Harg Island?
Well, I think, as Elliot was saying, that the numbers are actually, on the one hand, you can say they're impressive, but they're also actually quite limited. We're talking at the moment a total force, I believe, of something like 7,500 soldiers, and there's talk of sending another 10,000. So it's a nice number, but it's sufficient maybe to do Harg Island. It's not sufficient to take over Iran, to launch even a significant ground invasion. I very much hope that, look, I think that the only way to end this war in a satisfactory way from Israel's perspective, and maybe the American perspective as well, is to escalate. Because at the moment, it's the U.S. which seems to be very avid to reach and hold diplomatic talks with the Iranians. The Iranians are holding firm. They believe that they've gained the upper hand, that they've gained what's called escalation dominance. And I don't think that they're wrong in that belief. They're using the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, the pressure on the international oil and financial markets very effectively to put very heavy pressure on President Trump. And actually, he's the one who seems to want to bring it to a close even more than they want to.
It appears so, although he keeps threatening as well.
Well, threats are easy. It's carrying them out, which is the hard part. Right. And he backed down in, I believe, a rather humiliating way from the threat to attack the energy sites. Now, Trump can change his view at any time, and he may, I mean, he's invested in this war. I think he needs a victory of some sorts. So maybe he will go ahead and escalate somewhat. And I hope he does it sufficiently to turn the tide, because otherwise this is not going to end in a favorable way.
So now, speaking of boots on the ground, and I'll ask you, Elliot, in the 2003 war in Iraq, the U.S. had 300,000 American troops to begin with, and Iraq is just a fourth of the size of Iran. So, and I'm hearing some researchers say that occupying Iran in its entirety would require 1 million troops. Is this even something that the U.S. would consider? Would the Americans approve of this? Elliot, what do you think?
First of all, America doesn't have the force to do it. Let's keep in mind that the force that was sent into Iraq in 2003 was insufficient. It barely managed to accomplish the mission. And once Saddam was overthrown, it required what was called the surge, which was a nice way of saying we don't have enough force and we have to put more force in on the ground. So 300,000 troops to take over a country is trying to do it on the cheap, no matter what country it is of any size. And that's certainly true of Iran. You also get into the problem, which America learned in Iraq and Afghanistan the hard way, which is you broke it, you bought it. Now you own the problem, and you have to take control of it. Iran has an opposition, but not every Iranian is opposed to the regime. There's a very, very large population there that supports the regime, who are part of the radical Islamic movement and supporters, and they would have to be dealt with. So I don't want to put numbers on it, but whether it's 300,000 or 500,000 or 1 million, the United States does not have that force. It doesn't exist. And in order to do it, it would require a draft of grander than Vietnam War period proportions. I just don't see that happening.
And we know the Americans are quite traumatized by those kind of wars, the U.S. getting involved, be it Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
And rightly so. And rightly so.
Chuck, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. It's just not in the cards. The American public is strongly against even the limited operation that's underway at the moment. To talk about an invasion, the president would be, or the Republican Party would be defeated severely in the midterm elections. I don't think anybody's even thinking in those terms.
we're seeing that the Iranians are not really responding to these threats. It doesn't look like they're afraid of any kind of ground invasion. It doesn't look like they're afraid of anything, in fact.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I don't think they're afraid of a ground invasion. I think you're right about that, because they know it's just not in the cards.
Right.
But remember, this is a authoritarian regime, and their messaging is, let's say, even less accurate, less truthful than what we've seen come out of certain democracies in recent years. Mm-hmm. They portray an outward picture of everything is okay when it isn't. Iran has been hit very, very hard. And their economy, which was in terrible shape before the war, has been further hit, probably devastated by this war. Iran is isolated around the world far more than it was before the war, because the strategy that they adopted of attacking the neighboring Gulf states, on the one hand, yes, it's brought pressure on the U.S., but on the other hand, it has turned the Gulf states against them, and it's turned much of the world against them. So I think Iran and half of their leadership was killed. Iran is in a very, very difficult position. I don't think we should expect them to acknowledge that.
Right. I guess what I meant is that they don't ever seem to surrender or to show any signs of surrender. Now, there are reports that There are reports that Israel is rushing strikes ahead of a possible ceasefire, which may happen. Does that suggest concerns, in your opinion, Elliot, about an incomplete result?
That's always a concern. As Chuck mentioned earlier, it's a decision that ultimately will be made by President Trump. I don't want to say that he's capricious, but he's certainly not predictable. And he can wake up this morning, tomorrow morning.
Interesting comparison.
Erratic, in any event. It's something that's certainly a concern. Israel, the IDF, up until very recently, until this campaign, essentially, has been notoriously unconcerned, and incorrectly so, with timetables. And this goes back to 2006, and even before, certainly since October 7th, a sense of and a feeling that we have all the time in the world, which is simply not true. It's strategically false. It's politically false. But it's the way that the IDF has operated, even up through and including the 12-day campaign against Iran the last time around. So now I think, if nothing else, the Air Force has gotten the message, and they have their target packages set up in a way that they can be accelerated. But like anything else, if it's truncated, it's going to come up short. They'll just do the best they can under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you about the Houthis. We saw that they joined in this week. I'm surprised. What took them so long, Chuck?
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I expected them to get in far earlier, and once they fired the first missile, I thought that there would be more coming since then. They may be holding off themselves. They may be holding off at Iran's request for some more difficult stage from Iran's point of view, when they want to up the ante from their perspective, escalate from their perspective, and close off the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. And if they do that, they've closed off Hormuz, they've closed off Bab el-Mandeb, they've really closed off a 30-odd% of the global oil market. And that would, of course, create even more chaos in the global oil and financial markets.
And so, Elliot, what's stopping them from doing that? It is a threat that's on the table to close the Bab el-Mandeb. What's stopping them?
I think they were beaten up very badly last time around, particularly by the United States, but also by Israel. With the U.S. having massive force in the region, they don't want to go through that again. And they have the luxury that Hezbollah doesn't have, in that they can stand off, stand down. They are reliant on Iran, but not exclusively so, similar to Hamas in that sense, although there are many differences. If Iran goes, the Houthis will manage. They'll figure out some other way of gaining support. They'll hold off. Hezbollah, on the other hand, can't do that. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Quds Force of the IRGC. They're tied in tightly to Iran. So the Houthis have the option, and I think that they're trying to sit back. They're trying to see which way the wind blows. They don't want to draw American fire during or in the immediate aftermath of the Iran campaign. And America could certainly say, okay, we're taking a day off on Iran and we're going to dedicate everything to the Houthis, and that would not bode well for the Houthis. So they're playing coy, and I think they're making a strategically good decision to leave their options open, because once they step into it, there's no backing down.
I'm going to move on to Lebanon. Chuck, Israel is expanding its buffer zone in Lebanon toward the Litani River. Can you elaborate on this strategy? We heard Netanyahu speak about it before.
Well, the idea is to push Hezbollah's anti-tank weapons out of range. And here they're anti-tank weapons, but they're being used to target civilian targets. And it's just a matter of direct line of fire even. So if we push them back even 10 kilometers, then they're out of range. We're going past that to try and finally clear out southern Lebanon from Hezbollah forces entirely. Now, if this is a temporary deployment, that's one thing that I would fully support. If it's an attempt to reestablish a long-term security zone in Lebanon up to the Litani, well, we've been there, done that, and it was not a successful experience. So I very much hope that that's not what the plan is.
Mm-hmm. And Elliot, I'm assuming it's within Israel's interest to separate the Lebanon operation, the Lebanon war, from the war in Iran, so that if one stops, the other can continue. How likely is it that these two will be tied together?
There'll probably be an attempt to tie it together, but I don't see America forcing that issue. And America is really the only player that counts in that consideration. Mm-hmm. I think that since America really isn't involved in the Lebanon phase of it, if the Iran theater front gets shut down by Trump, I find it unlikely he's then going to turn to Israel and say, okay, you've got to stop in Lebanon as well. And here I want to agree 100% with what Chuck said. I always refer to the security zone as the insecurity zone. We basically extended ourselves and left ourselves exposed, and we saw the tragedies that led to in the decade of the 90s. So yes, go in, yes, clean it out. Keeping in mind, in addition to the anti-tank missiles, there was an invasion threat similar to what the Hamas Nukhba did on October 7th. It was actually a bigger plan by Nasrallah for his Redwan force to do that to the north. That's been largely removed. I'll just conclude that idea with, and as I said, I agree 100%. We should not be staying in there. We should be pulling back. If we allow them to retake South Lebanon, then we're going to be right back where we started from. In other words, there's a middle ground between holding it and denying it to them. And I think that we need to do what we're doing now, clean it out, withdraw, but have an active denial strategy that prevents them from returning, even if it's by air and artillery and occasional ground raids, but not cede South Lebanon back to Hezbollah.
And to add to that, if I may, we should be adding a diplomatic component to this, working with the Lebanese government to reach an agreement so that they will hopefully finally send in the Lebanese army to take control of the area and push and make sure that Hezbollah does not return.
If the Lebanese army is capable of doing it.
That's exactly my question. But the Lebanese government and army, they haven't come through until now. So how are we to expect them to do it this time around?
If we clear out the south, then it makes it comparatively easy for the Lebanese army to move in. And there is a lot of pressure from within Lebanon and there could be concerted American and other, but mostly American pressure on them after the war to do it. The Lebanese government wants to do it. We're in the better position in the past where the desire is there. There is still, of course, the question of capability.
No.
To some extent, it can improve the situation. There's no panacea here.
Now, working towards obliterating Hezbollah or deterring Hezbollah or having it surrender, this will likely take time. And the question is if Israel will have that time. What do you think, Elliot?
First of all, deterring them is meaningless. You can't deter organizations like that over the long term. You can do it over the short term. We saw that with Hamas. We saw it with Hezbollah. But ultimately, we're talking about hardcore ideological organizations. In this case, we're talking about radical Islamic with Hezbollah, Khomeiniist organization. So deterrence has very, very limited long-term impact. We're not going to be able to destroy them without taking over Lebanon, and we're not going to do that. So they can be weakened. And here, once again, I'll agree 100% with Chuck that the answer is Lebanon. The answer is the Lebanese government using the army to do it. And I think the best that we can hope for is weakening Hezbollah sufficiently militarily to allow the Lebanese army to do the job if they're willing to do it. Just another point here, the Lebanese army is a problematic one because it's largely made up of Shiites. It's not clear that they will follow the orders. But assuming they do, they have to be in a position where they have the capability to do it. Our job is to weaken Hezbollah sufficiently so that their capability is sufficient.
Chuck, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I don't have anything to add.
So around the world, they're showing the Lebanese and their hardships and the idea of attacking and not focusing so much, this doesn't surprise me, but not focusing on the reason why the IDF needs to secure Israel's northern border and all of the hardships that Israel's northern communities are going through. What are we getting wrong here, Elliot?
I don't know if we're getting wrong. You can always do a better job. But given the overall slant of the international media, they're telling the story that they want to tell because the story of northern Israel is certainly out there, but it's not being told, and that's by choice. Israel is by design being painted as the bad guy, and I think that showing or reporting what has happened and what's happening now, and I live in the north, I'm in that zone of Iranian as well as Hezbollah attacks. It's stressful to say the least. That's not being reported out there simply because the international media doesn't see it as a story.
Chuck, what do you think? Are we doing something wrong? Is Israel doing something wrong to convey this message out there?
Well, I think Israel's problem is that we have become the international villain. And this is the result of decades of Israeli policy regarding the West Bank, the whole Palestinian issue, settlements. It's whatever one thinks of it, pro or con. This has poisoned the international narrative to the point that, unfortunately, tragically, anything to do with Israel at this point pretty much is toxic. It's very, very hard to get our message out, even in areas where we're 100% right, and we're not always 100% right. The international community simply does not understand Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. They seem to be counterproductive if we wish to remain a Jewish and democratic state. There is considerable criticism about what we did in Gaza. We had a lot of support in the beginning, a lot of support. But then what seems to the world to have been great overkill turned them against us. Today, we can't do anything without being criticized.
And just before I conclude, I just want to say that a tweet has been, or a message has been taken out, published by U.S. President Donald Trump. He says, if we do not if talks don't work out, then they will attack all of the electric generating plants, oil wells, and Karg Island in Iran. We can see that post right now on the screen. Chuck Freilich and Elliot Chodov, thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And as the war with Iran unfolds, we now turn to a voice from inside the system, an Iranian writer, a human rights activist, and former political prisoner, Iraj Mistaghi. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me to your program.
Now, you've experienced the Iranian regime firsthand. How do you see this moment in Iran's history?
See, today marks 1 month since the attack by Israel and the United States on the Islamic Republic. The people of Iran are the only nation in the whole world who become worried when the sounds of bombs, missiles, and fighter jets stops. I have heard it from all over Iran. I have some contact. The people fear the halt of the war more than the war itself. Of course, it's tragic to attack Iran's infrastructure. It belongs to Iranian people. But even more tragic is the continuation of this Islamic Republic. The greatest threat to the people of Iran and to regional and global stability is the continuation of the Islamic Republic. Political Islam is a major threat to civilization and humanity, and above all, to Muslims themselves, who would have thought that during the month of Ramadan, attack would be carried out against Islamic countries, especially the land where Islam originated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What are you hearing from people inside Iran right now? How are they experiencing this war?
You see, they are full of fear. But more than that, they are thinking about you see, they are thinking, they are worrying. I have heard about people that they are fearing, why? The halt of the war, more than the war itself. This is why that I said. They think that if we have this war, and after the war, survivor of Iranian regime, you see, this is the disaster. They are thinking about what will happen next. This is very, maybe nobody in the whole world can understand Iranian people nowadays, because we know that negotiation with this regime is a major mistake. The regime must not be allowed to survive. This is a cancerous tumor that must be removed. And let me tell you something. In my opinion, I know this regime. I have spoken about this regime. I have written about them. I know the system. And I know, in my opinion, the major mistake to the United States and Israel was that after targeting Khamenei and members of the Supreme Defense Council, they allowed the regime forces to take to the streets and reorganize themselves, not targeting the head of executive, legislative, and judicial branches, nor the members of the cabinet and the government institution, in the hope that someone would be left for negotiation. It was a big mistake. It's a huge mistake. I know that no one would dare to surrender after killing of Khamenei. I'm certain that this regime, I'm certain that this regime will move toward nuclear weapons after this war. And this nuclear bombs is intended to be launched at Israel.
Well, hopefully not, and hopefully it'll be stopped before then. But how strong would you say is the regime's control over the public today?
See, they are on the street. They are targeting. They have with machine gun. If you have seen they are in the streets everywhere, and they control the people. And we not just come out from a massacre during January in 2 days, 40,000 people were massacred. You haven't seen it anywhere. You see, anywhere.
Tragically so, yeah.
Yes.
Now, we've heard messages from Israel and from the U.S., from Netanyahu, from Trump, directing the Iranian people to go out into the streets and make history when the time comes. Do these messages resonate? Do you believe the Iranian people will go out to the streets soon?
You see, not during the attack, not during the war.
Right.
You know, I understand it because I have been in this situation when I was in prison. I've seen it. I remember that the whole family, even our family, they left the cities during the war between Iran and the city attacked by Israel, by Iraq and Iran. You know, the missile, the launch missile to Tehran and other cities. And I remember even our family, they left the city. Now, I understand the people, they are full of fear. But this is what I think that in this situation, the people, they are not coming to the street. You remember during 12 days war in June, the people, they didn't come to the street. But in January, they came to the street. But I think that in this time, we shouldn't let them to survive. And this is why I support any attack or operation that would bring an end to this regime. And you see, I'm opposed to war and destruction, but I know this regime is more dangerous to Iran and to humanity than any other threat. I accept war if it means fearing the world from this regime. Fearing.
No, I just wanted to say everyone says that no one can overthrow a regime but the Iranian people themselves. And the big question that I guess everyone is asking is will they actually do it?
This is what, yes, I think that the Iranian regime must overthrow this regime. I know that, and I believe that. And I think this is the only solution. And I don't think that Israel can overthrow this regime or USA. Their obligation is overthrowing this regime. I don't think that. I think the Iranian should do that. But I think when you start a war, when you start, this scale of war, if you stop it right now, we have this regime, we have plus destruction, plus poverty. And this is the problem.
Well, Iraj Mesdaghi, thank you very much for all of this valuable input. You're saying press forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
After a missile strike hit the Basin oil refinery in Haifa today and a chemical facility near Beersheba yesterday, environmental fears were raised. We're now joined by Elad Hochman, an environmental expert and CEO at Green Course, to discuss the environmental impact. Thanks for joining. Elad,
thank you very much.
We're now hearing about a strike on this Basin oil refinery in Haifa a short while ago. How concerning is a hit on that type of facility? What could be the implications?
So the implications are already known. We've seen the implications of the strike of the IDF in Tehran just a week and a half ago, and the fire and the pollution that it caused over there, air pollution, ground pollution. The sea might be hit, and of course it hits our health, our security, the sense of security. Just imagine what would have happened if this missile strike, for the third time, in fact, would strike in the heart of the refineries in Haifa, at Bazan in Haifa. This can cause a huge blast as well. It's not an environmental issue anymore. We are claiming in the past decade that Bazan, in the heart of population, in the heart of Haifa and the area around, we're talking about the metropolitan of over 1 million people, is dangerous. And the solution that Eli Cohen, the Minister of Energy, and his suggestion is to move Bazan to the Negev, blew up in our faces yesterday when a missile caught and fell over Adama in the petrochemical area of Ramat Chovav, of Neot Chovav, and caused a huge fire over there. We're talking about another metropolitan, close to 12 kilometers off of Beersheba, right next to a Bedouin community, a village of Wadi El Naam, which contains over 10,000 people. We're talking about a huge threat to the population. And in our eyes, in our minds, I think that you don't need to be a military general or an expert to understand that a bomb, a ticking bomb, is not something that you will move from Haifa to the Negev. It's something that you have to dismantle, and you have to just close, just according to the government decision that was made just 4 years ago in 2022, to close the refineries in Haifa. Because of this. So
now,
we're talking about
how many such facilities do we have in Israel that are, like you say, a ticking bomb?
So these ticking bombs are known, unfortunately, also to our enemies, and we're seeing Iranian regime trying to bomb them all the time. Okay, you see that by the day, over a month. We're talking about the oil refineries in Haifa, okay, the huge refineries over there. We're talking about the Ashdod oil refineries that are also threatening the metropolitan of Ashdod and Ashkelon. We're talking about containers of fuel that are not protected enough, that were struck by Hamas, okay, in our last war, in Tzuk Eitan, in Ashkelon, and we're talking in the threat that posed to the people of Eilat and Eilot area in Katza. Okay, all of those areas are targets. Those are strategic targets, and it's predictable. Okay, it's predictable that the Iranian regime will try to harm them and will try to bomb them, and we are seeing that. We saw that also in Charavot Barzel that Hamas tried to hit them and Hezbollah is trying to hit them. These are ticking bombs, and we have to close them. And the government decision offering us another strategy in Israel to our energy. Okay, and we're talking about more renewable energies. Okay, the Ministry of Energy. Eli Cohen, in the first week of this war, of epic fury, they came out with a major announcement to the press that half of Israel's power is provided by renewables. What would have happened if all of our energy sector would go and would pursue more? And would pursue 100% of energy, renewable energy power. Okay, these threats, these environmental threats during regular times, and especially during wars, will just go away. And this is exactly what we are claiming, and this is exactly what we are pursuing in the Knesset, and also demanding from the Ministry of Environmental Protection to say. To stop giving them any permits to pollute the air.
Now, as this war continues, because we don't know when exactly it will end, how concerned should we be about future strikes on industrial, energy, or chemical sites?
So we're seeing the direct link. When Israel bombs infrastructure in Iran, Iran aims exactly to the same infrastructure in Israel. The only difference is the fact that Israel is a small country. Any unfortunate hit in those facilities might cause a major disaster. And this is why we have to change our way of thinking, okay? Right. We came to this war, as opposed to the IDF that came to this war prepared with They say it was a bank of targets. Okay, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Prime Minister, the Ministry of Environmental Protection are not ready and came unprepared to the strategic threats of those facilities. And we are seeing that during this war. Again, what would have happened if it... Yeah.
So absolute room for improvement on this front. Elad Ochman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As Israel faces a complex moment of war, we now turn to speak with a new immigrant from the United States to Israel who just made Aliyah, immigrated, and arrived straight into this complex reality. Yosef Farka, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So you landed in Israel just last week. What was it like arriving into a country at war? You've been here before, but still, this is quite a war.
Right. I've never seen Ben Gurion Airport so empty, so that was a little surprising. But I would say it also felt good to be, with, millions of Jews during this time that are all going through wartime, right? So I think it did feel special to be, now part of, I'd say the Jewish people. And obviously there's a lot of Jewish people that now live outside of Israel too. So it's important to recognize that. But I think that Israel is the center, and this is where things are happening. I think this is the center of the Jewish world.
Now, you left a job and a life in New York. You made Aliyah with the help of Nefesh B'Nefesh. Do you even question the timing, or does this moment strengthen your decision?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely not easy to leave the United States. There's a lot of challenges, as you mentioned. I left my job and that sort of thing. I definitely did question the timing. I think it'd be silly not to. For me, I think the decision to go now was, part of a process, right? Because it's not that I decided to go specifically during wartime. I wanted to make Aliyah for a long time. And, the plan was to leave on the 24th of March for a while. And then the war started. So really it was a question of, am I pushing it off due to the war or not? And, I think that there's an interesting secret that I like to keep in mind, which for me personally, I viewed the war as more of a personal test for me in, meriting to live in the land of Israel in my lifetime. We learned that the word nis, which is the word for miracle, is hidden in the same root word, which is nisayon, a test. So I personally believe that for me, this war was a test for me to live in the land of Israel in my lifetime. Obviously I'm dating someone here, which was a big part of that decision. So I didn't want to push it off. For a few reasons, I just decided to do it now. Also specifically because I thought if I didn't do it now, it's kind of like a lot of Jews. I saw them leaving Israel, coming back. I know a lot of Jews come back anyways before Passover, before Pesach and that sort of thing, with regard to leaving the seminaries and the yeshivas this time of year. But I just thought it wasn't a good look when a lot of Jews were leaving through Egypt, actually, to leave the land of Israel, when during this period of time, it was all about being freed from Egypt in order to get to the land of Israel. So I just thought it was a little bit ironic what was happening in this time period. And I just thought, I don't want to be pushing it off in order to get to Israel now, specifically.
Wow, that's quite a story. And, we're nearing the holiday of Passover just in a few days from now, where we're learning about the great exodus of the people of Israel into the land of Israel. So that's very symbolic that this is the time you chose to make your Aliyah, your immigration into Israel. What have your family and friends in the U.S. said to you about this? What are they saying to you now?
Yeah, look, I think that everyone's proud, that I actually did it, because I've been saying I wanted to do it for a long time, and I finally did it, especially during this time. It's not a simple time. Now, obviously, there are missiles ballistic missiles. They're no joke. You know, they have killed people. They have caused destruction. So I'm following the instructions of the Home Front Command, and you know, as they say, it saves lives. So look, I think everyone really wants to live in the land of Israel. Even the anti-Zionists that are Jewish, they want to live in the land of Israel. Just a matter of timing for them. I think everyone agrees living in the land of Israel is a blessing. And I want to say thank you to God for really giving me the opportunity to live in the land of Israel in my lifetime. And also to everyone involved in the journey, for me personally, which is my family, first and foremost, my friends, you know, Tamara, which is the girl I'm dating. And you know, I feel blessed to be here. I would say, I also want to specifically say thank you to Nefesh B'Nefesh for, you know, making the process so simple, especially during the wartime and everything like that. They were very accommodating, very communicative in order to, you know, give me updates and let me know, okay, the flight's coming this time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot less people would be making Aliyah if it weren't for Nefesh B'Nefesh.
Right,
and,
for the assistance.
Yeah, I'm very grateful.
Can you tell me just what was it like, the first siren that you heard since you made your Aliyah, since you immigrated here?
Yeah, the first siren, you know, it's a little bit shocking, you know, because you think, hey, like if this lands on my building, like I'm done. You know what I mean? Like it's no joke.
Yeah.
But I mean, the truth is that they say if you're in the safe room, you have a lot better odds. So I've been not taking any chances and staying in the safe room until I get the alert that it's safe to leave from my phone. But I'd say specifically with regard to the sirens, my perspective is that I'm grateful that there's the early warning system. Like the fact that I have a lot of time to know, okay, you need to get to a shelter. I think that's an amazing thing. I also want to say with regard to the sirens and the missiles in general that are coming, I think it's part of a wider story. It's part of those that wish to kill millions of Jews and do as much destruction as possible. They're not hitting military targets. They're hitting, they're specifically using cluster bombs and munitions to cause as much damage as possible to infrastructure and kill as many people as possible. So I think it's part of a wider story, and it's also related to everything else that's going on, the war on all fronts, right? With Hezbollah, Hamas, you have the Houthis now that entered the war. You have the Palestinian terror organizations in Yehuda and Shomron in the West Bank. You have the Iraqi militias, and then obviously Iran and those who wish to kill us in Syria. I think it's part of a wider story of those that are wishing to do the Jewish people harm. And I think it's very important to also keep in mind that it's also about the message. It's not only about the messenger. So yes, we do need to go after our enemies, but I think it's very important to acknowledge the root cause, which I think is a message from God to realign with.
Yosef, we have to wrap up, but that's a powerful message. Yosef Falka, thank you very much, and good luck on your new journey here in Israel.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Now that's a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour, broadcasting live from Israel and the heart of the Middle East. I'm Sivan Raviv. Thank you very much.
Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Najar Gravelazi, and coming up in today's newscast. 1 month to Operation Roaring Lion, and the IDF says it's only days away from completing its attacks against Iran's vital military infrastructure. And the Houthis officially joined the war, launching missiles and drones at southern Israel. And on the northern front, the IDF confirms 1 soldier was killed in Lebanon. It's been 1 full month since Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury began with joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on the Islamic Republic of Iran. The IDF is continuing its strikes on the regime's infrastructure and nuclear facilities with full force and says that within a matter of days it will complete its attacks on all the vital components of Iran's military industry. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz has the latest.
After 1 month of Operation Roaring Lion, the IDF has full control over Iran's skies, degrading the regime's military capabilities at will.
שלום לכולם. היום אנחנו מציינים 4 שבועות מתחילת מבצע שאגת הארי. צה"ל תוקף ללא הפסקה, גם באיראן וגם בלבנון. אנחנו פועלים יחד עם צבא ארצות הברית ורודפים את משטר הטרור האיראני. במקביל, צה"ל תוקף גם את חיזבאללה. אנחנו מפרקים להם יכולות ומגבירים את הלחץ. יש לנו הזדמנות לשינוי המצב מיסודו. ההישגים טובים מאוד, אבל יש עוד סיכונים, גם לכוחותינו וגם לעורף הישראלי. אנחנו ממשיכים לפעול על פי תוכנית, בתקיפה שיטתית ורחבה שהוכנה מראש ומותאמת כל הזמן למצב.
Over the weekend, 50 Israeli Air Force fighter jets carried out coordinated strikes across 3 areas in Iran, targeting core infrastructure tied to the regime's nuclear weapons and military production programs. The IDF confirmed it struck the Arak heavy water plant in central Iran following the identification of renewed reconstruction efforts at the site. Heavy water is a unique material used to operate nuclear reactors, such as the inactive reactor in Iraq, which was designed to produce military-grade plutonium. The materials are also used to produce a neutron source for nuclear weapons. Other targets struck included a one-of-a-kind uranium enrichment facility in Ardakan and primary facility for the production of missiles and sea mines in Yazid.
בהנחיית הרמטכ"ל העמקנו את הפגיעה בתעשיות הצבאיות באיראן. עכשיו אני יכול לומר שבתוך מספר ימים בודדים אנחנו נשלים את תקיפת כלל הרכיבים החיוניים לתעשייה. זה אומר שנשמיד את מרבית יכולות הייצור הצבאיות, ויקח למשטר הרבה זמן לשקם אותן.
According to Iranian reports, the IDF also struck 2 major steel plants, the Mobarakeh Steel Company in Isfahan and the Khuzestan Steel Company in Avaz. Israeli defense officials said the facilities are part of Iran's military-industrial supply chain and are partially owned by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Both companies operating the plants are reportedly under U.S. sanctions. A report in the New York Times cited a senior Iranian official as saying the strikes dealt a significant blow to the country's economy. Following the strikes, the regime issued threats against steel plants across the Middle East, including in Israel and Arab states in the Gulf. Defense Minister Israel Katz said that Israel will intensify and widen its strikes on the Islamic regime to additional targets and areas that assist the regime in building and operating the weapons used against Israeli civilians.
ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו ואני הזהרנו את משטר הטרור האיראני להפסיק את ירי הטילים לעבר האוכלוסייה האזרחית בישראל. למרות האזהרות, הירי נמשך, ולכן תקיפות צה"ל באיראן יעלו מדרגה והתרחבו למטרות ותחומים נוספים שמסייעים למשטר בבניית והפעלת אמצעי הלחימה נגד אזרחי ישראל. הם ישלמו מחירים כבדים, הולכים וגוברים על פשע המלחמה הזה.
And while the United States is reportedly engaging in diplomatic talks with the Islamic Republic of Iran to end the war, the Pentagon is reportedly preparing for a possible weeks-long ground operation in Iran should diplomacy fail. Thousands of U.S. troops have been deployed to the Middle East. ILTV's Devo Klein has the details.
The Pentagon is preparing for possible weeks-long ground operations in Iran. According to the Washington Post and multiple outlets, planning focused more on limited raids and targeted missions rather than a full-scale invasion. These could involve special operations forces and conventional troops aimed at strategic objectives such as Harg Island and other coastal sites. Thousands of U.S. troops, including Marines and elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, have been deployed to the Middle East, intensifying speculation about ground action if diplomacy fails. The arrival of 3,500 Marines aboard the USS Tripoli has further fueled discussions that the U.S. military is positioning forces capable of conducting ground operations on Iranian territory. President Trump announced last week he was extending a deadline to attack Iran's energy infrastructure by 10 days, until April 6th, as the two countries are reportedly engaged in serious diplomatic talks to end the war. Yet, the Wall Street Journal, citing both U.S. and Saudi sources, reported that Iran attacked the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia Friday night, injuring at least 12 U.S. soldiers, 2 in serious condition, and damaging U.S. military refueling aircraft. The report said the attack involved a ballistic missile and numerous drones. This marks the second time since the start of the war that Iran has targeted the airbase in Saudi Arabia. President Trump has yet to respond to this latest escalation, but so far he seems to be sticking to his extended deadline. On Friday night, prior to the strikes, the president had this to say.
Tonight we're closer than ever to the rise of the Middle East that is finally free at last from Iranian terror, aggression, and nuclear blackmail. That's what's happened. It was nuclear blackmail for years and years. And beyond that, there was blackmail, period. Under my leadership, America is ending the threat posed by this radical regime. For 47 years, Iran has been known as the bully of the Middle East, but they are not the bully any longer.
President Trump also revealed that Iran gifted him 10 ships of oil, which they allowed to pass through the closed Strait of Hormuz, in what he said was a sign of good faith. So far, both Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance have echoed the president's words. And so the question now remains, will the Iranian regime concede defeat and agree to a deal before the April 6 deadline, or will President Trump be forced to once again unleash the full might of the American military?
And remember the Houthis? Well, they have officially joined the war, firing ballistic missiles and UAVs at southern Israel for the very first time since the Iran war began. And they have pledged to continue. All the details in the following report. Sirens sounded twice in Israel's southernmost city of Eilat as the Houthis, the Iranian terror proxy from Yemen, attacked Israel for the first time since the start of the war on February 28th.
فإن القوات المسلحة اليمنية بعون الله تعالى وبالتوكل عليه نفذت أول عملية عسكرية وذلك بدفعة من الصواريخ البالستية والتي استهدفت أهدافا عسكرية حساسة للعدو الإسرائيلي جنوبي فلسطين المحتلة.
Israel confirmed that it intercepted a lone ballistic missile early Saturday from Yemen. No casualties were reported. Then again on Saturday evening, sirens sounded as an unmanned aerial drone was intercepted over the skies of Eilat. This marks a dramatic escalation as the Iranian regime is once again calling on one of its regional terror proxies to join the conflict. While the Houthis are largely seen as a nuisance with limited military capabilities, they have shown they are capable of disrupting key global shipping lanes around the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea, as they did in support of Hamas following October 7, 2023. Now they have once again entered the war, reviving the so-called axis of resistance.
عملياتنا بعون الله تعالى سوف تستمر حتى تتحقق الأهداف المعلنة وكما جاء في البيان السابق للقوات المسلحة وحتى يتوقف العدوان على كافة جبهات المقاومة.
And not just Iran and the Houthis from Yemen, but the northern front is also significantly heating up as IDF troops continue to carry out ground operations inside of southern Lebanon, engaging Hezbollah terrorists and dismantling terror infrastructure. An IDF soldier was killed and 3 others wounded in clashes with Hezbollah. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
The IDF announced this morning that a soldier was killed and 3 others wounded during fighting in southern Lebanon. The slain soldier was named as Sergeant Moshe Yitzchak Cohen Katz, age 22, from the Paratroopers Brigade from New Haven, Connecticut, in the U.S. The 3 wounded soldiers were listed in moderate condition and were transferred to hospital for medical care. The IDF says their families were informed. Israeli airstrikes against Hezbollah targets in Beirut and throughout southern Lebanon continued throughout Sunday.
בלבנון, כוחות פיקוד הצפון בהובלת מפקד הפיקוד תוקפים ומביאים להישגים רבים. כוחות צה"ל מתמרנים בדרום לבנון ומעמיקים את מרחב ההגנה הקדמי. שליטה במרחב הזה מונעת ירי ישיר ליישובים. לשם כך אנחנו פועלים כרגע. לצד הפעולות האלו, אנחנו כל הזמן מתמקדים בפגיעה ביכולות שיגור הירי לעבר ישראל.
The IDF said that to date, it's eliminated some 850 Hezbollah terrorists. Among them, on Saturday, the IDF confirmed that it eliminated Ali Hassan Shaib, who for years operated as a Hezbollah Radwan Force terrorist
under the guise of a journalist. According to the army, Shaib worked with the Hezbollah-affiliated Al-Manar network while working within the terror group's elite intelligence unit. As such, the IDF says Shaib would use his credentials as a journalist to expose the locations of IDF soldiers operating in South Lebanon and along the border, and relayed the information to Hezbollah Radwan forces. 2 other journalists were also killed in the strike.
חשוב לי לומר, למול הירי של חיזבאללה לעבר הצפון, לוחמי צה"ל ביבשה וחיל האוויר פועלים בשעות אלה גם בעומק וגם בדרום לבנון. ככל שהפעולה שלנו מעמיקה, הכוחות נתקלים ביותר איומים ויותר מחבלים. הלוחמים פועלים באומץ, בתנאים מורכבים, תוך סיכון חייהם, ומצליחים להשמיד את האויב ולדחוק אותו.
And joining us now with more on the latest as we enter week 5 of the war with Iran is Colonel Rich Outson, Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So there are so many developments just over the past 24 hours. I want to start with the Houthis. They've announced they're joining the war. They've launched a missile at Israel, a drone at Israel. What do you make of this? And will it have any real impact on the war against the Iranian regime?
Well, it's an incremental change rather than a categoric change. The fact that Iran has absorbed as much punishment as it has, and its proxies closer to Israel's borders, especially in Lebanon, have taken such a beating, means that they're trying to relieve some pressure, right? So the Houthis don't dispose of military capabilities greater than maybe harassment level is what I would call it. But that matters. That matters because it's part of the political and psychological game here. President Trump, certainly in the U.S., and I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel are both coming under significant domestic stress to show that this has an end, that this war will not continue ad infinitum. So the ability to add one more chess piece on the board, so to speak, I think strengthens Tehran's ability to say, we can outlast you. And the actual military capabilities represented, again, it's not nothing, but they're not going to be sinking a bunch of ships or destroying air bases and cities and things like that. So it's more of a harassment. It's going to require more of the air defense attention from the coalition, from the United States and Israel especially. So not a great development from our perspective. And the Houthis have seen this before, right? We've been in this tit for tat with the Houthis. Yeah. They see it as survivable, but it's not the main show. The main show remains Straits of Hormuz and the negotiations between Washington and Tehran.
So let's speak a little bit about the negotiations. You know, President Trump extended the deadline to bomb the major energy infrastructure until April 6th. And he says negotiations are going well and that the Iranians are, at least behind the scenes, begging for a deal. But at the same time, we're seeing, Iran strike the U.S. base in Saudi Arabia. We're seeing, the Pentagon reportedly amassing troops here in the Middle East. What is your analysis of all of this, and why would Trump even extend the deadline in the first place?
Well, I think Trump is a pragmatic and instrumental thinker. So he knows what he wants from the end of this war. And it is a more malleable regime in Tehran, a new regime, possibly, but not necessarily. Just a regime that observes his red lines, which I largely overlap with Israel's red lines with regards to support of proxies in the region, nuclear weaponization, and the ballistic missile program. I think it is, he's agnostic on whether we get there through crippling Iran to the point where they simply can't do those things, or whether he obtains the political objective of having them renounce these things or moderate and stop these things on their own. Now, negotiating is not an alternative to fighting. That this is sort of a precept in the West that largely is not borne out in practice. It's not talk, 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 negotiate, negotiate, or fight, fight, fight. It's talk, fight, talk, fight. So if you don't have the preparation to, say, seize the Greater and Lesser Tums Islands or Abu Musa, the other islands near the Straits of Hormuz, or to conduct strikes on the Iranian littoral so that you deny them the operational use of the Straits of Hormuz or the control of it anyway, if you don't have that on the table, then your negotiating position's weak. And the Iranians certainly don't respect weak negotiating positions. So I think That two-track approach of extending negotiations, playing the psychological game of telling the Iranian people and the world, look, we're close, they're getting weaker, they're going to concede, at the same time that you up the pressure militarily, is entirely consistent with best practice, and I think that's what Trump's applying.
Now, both the United States and Israel are saying that they've achieved nearly all of the military targets. Israel says it needs just a couple more days to sort of cripple the vital military infrastructure. Yet, you know, the regime is still standing. It still has the capability to close the Strait of Hormuz, to fire missiles at Israel and Gulf countries. So, in your assessment, I mean, how much longer will it take to truly achieve the military objectives, and can they truly be achieved militarily?
Well, in final analysis, no. It's warfare is always a political act. It's, among other things, it's a military technical act where you have forces fighting one another. But history is replete with examples of superior forces that at the operational and tactical levels pummel their opposition and defeat them. Think Germans against the Russians on the East Front in World War II. Think the British even against the American colonists when they were fighting for their independence. And it's the tale of absorbing punishment and running from one defeat to another, but surviving. So when the militarily weaker force can survive, sometimes that's enough. And the militarily superior force gets tired of the whole thing and either walks away or compromises on their own. So the truth is there is probably no level of operational military success and destruction that Israel and the United States can inflict upon Iran that will force a decision in this way, as long as they still have the will to resist. Breaking that will to resist is not a military task. It's a political, a propaganda, and a psychological task. Now, this is where the divisions within Iran matter greatly, as does the support of allies. Iran needs to feel isolated from the countries around it. As long as there's other countries that are saying, just stop, it's not worth it, then Iran will hold on. And unfortunately, this is why it's important to make your case to coalition partners. Israel and the United States, we'll see if they're able to pull this off largely on their own. But when you don't have a large coalition supporting you, then the indirect psychological support to the target is massive, because everybody looks on and says this should just stop. And I think we're at this very careful inflection point where a little bit more pain may get Tehran to that point of saying, okay, that's it, we'll compromise on these things. But there's no guarantee of it. And again, with history as our guide, many times the weaker force does survive.
Absolutely. You really have to ask, where are the European allies? Where is NATO in all of this? Colonel Rich Outzen, thank you so much for joining us and for your analysis today.
Good to be with you.
And as missiles rain down across Israel, reaching safety and managing daily life during the war is far harder for people with disabilities. During this war, mobility challenges leave some families living almost entirely inside their bomb shelters, unable to reach food, medicine, or essential care. For 35 years, Chimes Israel has helped children and adults with disabilities through therapy, essential care, and employment support. But because of this war, children with disabilities are losing critical therapies, and adults are losing daily structure and human contact. Even some staff members' homes have been destroyed by attacks, yet they continue serving the people who depend on them. Chimes Israel needs your help during this war to deliver therapy, medicine, food, and essentials directly to families' homes. It also needs to build a protected shelter for vulnerable preschoolers. In times like these, we are called to stand with the most vulnerable among us. So please do not forget the children and adults with disabilities in Israel during this war. And if you want, you can help today to make the difference. And as rockets continue to strike Israel, ILTV's Mayan Hoffman reports from the scene of one of the weekend's hardest hit areas.
Thank you, Lidar. I'm standing here in Eshtaol in the absolute pouring rain today, where you can still see the impact behind me. Damaged homes, shattered cars, and a community really trying to process what happened in just seconds. As missile fire continues across multiple fronts, this is becoming a familiar scene for many Israelis. For a closer look at the weekend that was full of attacks, let's take a look at my report. One person was killed and dozens were injured over the weekend as Iran and its proxies continued sustained missile and rocket attacks across Israel, with the heaviest damage reported in central regions. The fatality occurred Friday night in Ashdod, where a direct missile impact killed a man and wounded several others. Hours later and into Shabbat, additional barrages struck multiple areas, keeping much of the country on high alert. The most significant strike hit Moshav Eshtaol on Saturday afternoon. At least 19 people were injured, all lightly, including 5 children, according to Hadassah Medical Center. Homes, a synagogue, and dozens of vehicles were damaged, with emergency teams describing a wide destruction zone and residents emerging shaken but conscious. Elsewhere, impacts and shrapnel were reported across Tel Aviv and Gush Dan, while additional injuries were recorded as civilians rushed to shelters. In the south, missiles triggered sirens in Beersheba and surrounding areas, including a first-ever strike by Yemen's Houthi forces, though no injuries were reported. According to Magen David Adom, 45 people required treatment over Shabbat, while the health ministry says more than 5,600 people have been evacuated to hospitals since the start of the operation, with over 130 still hospitalized.
And today we once again have the pleasure of hearing from Yael Eckstein, president of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, as she brings us the latest highlights and inspiring updates from the fellowship's ongoing work.
Shalom from here in Israel, and here are 2 fellowship projects that you should know about this week, and I'm actually telling you about them from inside of a bomb shelter. Number 1. Before the war with Iran broke out, the fellowship was preparing many projects to be able to respond immediately during times of crisis. One of the things that we prepared were thousands of emergency cards with money on them that we can distribute to people whose homes have been hit, people who have lost everything in the war and have nowhere to turn. In every single city in Israel that's in need, and especially those that are most affected by the war, the fellowship is on the ground helping the people. Number 2, the fellowship recently went to go deliver food to elderly Holocaust survivors in Petach Tikva. And so the fellowship went to go deliver food to Nahum, the Holocaust survivor. And right before we went in, the siren sounded. We ran to the shelter. Immediately after, we went up to Nahum's apartment, and he was shaken, but thank God alive. And what was so heartbreaking was when we were in the shelter, the only thing these elderly were asking for was, "Do you have my food? Because my cupboard is empty." There you have it. From here in a shelter, you now know about 2 more projects of the fellowship. Join me next week, same place, same time, for more updates on what's happening on the ground. Hello.
If you follow ILTV, now you can wear it too. Welcome to the official ILTV store at www.iltvshop.com, where you'll find our latest merchandise, from the famous ILTV mug to t-shirts, caps, and more. And now, for this historic moment, we've launched a special Roaring Lion collection, featuring the official Roaring Lion 2026 t-shirt, designed with the official campaign emblem and a matching cap. Every purchase helps support independent journalism from Israel and the work we do every day to bring you the real story. Visit www.iltvshop.com, explore the collection, and wear the story.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Cloudy skies expected around most of the country tonight, with temperatures reaching lows of 11 degrees Celsius or 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll see cloudy skies and light rain showers alongside steady temperatures and highs of 17 degrees Celsius or 63 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channels and keep up with us on social media. That's at ILTV_Israel on all platforms. You can also catch us on Screen IL with 24/7 live coverage. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Ladar Gravelazi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.
As war continues across Israel, thousands of workers will receive only partial paychecks before Passover. 5,000 families are currently on the waiting list for a Passover food basket from Yad Ezra v'Shulamit, Israel's largest distributor of food baskets to the poor in Israel. Joining us now is Yad Ezra v'Shulamit Resource Manager Danny Gewirtz to give us the inside scoop on what's happening today. Danny, thank you for joining us. Right now, we're just a few days before Passover. I want to ask you, what are you witnessing in terms of how this war is impacting Israeli families?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Good to be here. When war surges, it doesn't just hit the front lines, it drains the lifeline of organizations like ours. I think what we're seeing here right now, Emily, is what I call the perfect storm. As you mentioned, it's right before Pesach, so the timing really couldn't be worse. We have a war, there's less funds available. Many organizations are fighting for that piece of pie that's out there to give to organizations like ours. The shekel dollar rate is killing us, as many of our donors have found out. People aren't working also. People, of course, are at home. They're home with their kids. Our fundraisers, who should be out in the States right now, have been basically grounded. The local telemarketers haven't been able to go to work. I should be out there going and talking to major donors. It's heartbreaking, really, what's going on, because we're struggling to even reach the 60,000 food baskets, which every year we're committed to giving. And as you mentioned, we have 5,000 families on a waiting list that don't know if they will even have the assistance that Yad Ezra v'Shulamit gives them, and that they depend on every single year.
Who's being hit hardest by this war that you've seen so far?
Well, it's hardworking families, families with lots of children, the elderly, Holocaust victims, anyone who depends really on Yad Ezra v'Shulamit for their basic needs, for that food basket that comes to them. And it's just been very, very tough. It's basically just people who depend on us for food.
Those who are really in need right now. I do want to ask you, I mean, given the unique circumstances, you spoke a bit about it, but how does the fundraising this year compare to previous years?
Well, as I mentioned, the fundraisers have basically been grounded, as you can't leave the country. The telemarketers are basically at work, so they haven't been hitting the phones. And it's really created a shortfall in our ability to meet that commitment of 60,000 food baskets. We have 5,000 people on a waiting list, and I'm imploring people, or challenging them, to take the food basket challenge, as the jargon goes here today, to go out there, and if everyone who's watching will take on a food basket or two, it'll really help narrow the gap of where we would like to be. So there's a saying in the Haggadah, I'm sure you're familiar with it, halach manya, let them come and eat. And that's a call for everyone to host people into their houses, to give people to eat. It's hard to do, obviously, but people can really actually do that before all and go and donate a food basket and make sure that people who depend on us have what to eat. The holiday is so expensive. I'm sure you realize food prices have been soaring for years. But Passover always sees an increase in those food prices. And people can help if they just want to. They can go out and they can scan the code there, and they can actually give a food basket to a needy family in Israel, a poor, needy family. These are the vulnerable people who are really feeling the effects of the war. But the audience, your audience, can go out there and make a difference.
Absolutely. I think the need is perhaps greater than it has been for quite some time. The last 2 years in general has been difficult, but definitely right now a challenging time. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and for joining us today, Danny.
Thank you very much.
And moving on, as Israel navigates ongoing tensions with the Islamic Republic, many families are rethinking what it means to build a secure future here. For some, that includes the dream of owning a home. But in today's climate, the process can feel uncertain and overwhelming. That's where Aliyah comes in. With teams across the country, the company provides end-to-end guidance from choosing the right location to coordinating legal and financial steps. Their goal is simple: to bring clarity and confidence to buyers during a complex time. Because today, buying a home in Israel isn't just an investment, it's a step towards stability. To learn more, scan the QR code on your screen.
Welcome back to Axis of Truth as the U.S.-Israel war on the Islamic Republic carries on. This week, we're going to start with one of the most repeated claims that we're hearing right now in Washington, in the media, and increasingly across social media, which is that the Islamic Republic is not an imminent threat, and that despite everything we're seeing, the regime does not, in fact, seek a nuclear weapon. Now, this argument sounds serious, and it's often presented as the realist position. But the problem is that it collapses the moment that you actually compare what the regime says about its own capabilities and intentions to what it's actually doing in reality. And we got a very, very clear example of that just this week. For years, the Islamic Republic has insisted that its ballistic missile program is limited to a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers. This has not just been a technical detail, it's been a central claim used in diplomatic discussions, as well as in policy analysis and arguments about why Iran can be contained as a regional power rather than a global one. This claim actually came from the very top of the regime just this past week with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Take a look.
We intentionally kept the range of our missiles below 2,000 kilometers. So we don't have that capability, and we don't want to do that because we don't have any hostility against, the United States people or Europeans or whatsoever.
And here is the late Supreme Leader himself lying about exactly the same thing.
موشک بالستیکمون از راه دور که 2,000 کیلومتره که اونم 2,000 کیلومتر رو بنده گفتم. خیلی اینا می‌خواستن برن تا 4-5,000 کیلومتر. من نگذاشتم. بله آقا علتی داره دیگه، حالا علتی داره. من مانع شدم. یعنی گفتم بیشتر از 2,000 کیلومتر.
What you're seeing there is the Supreme Leader himself repeating that limitation, which has been echoed by officials and by analysts for years as if it were a fact. Except that this week, the Islamic Republic targeted the United States and UK military base at Diego Garcia, which is located in the Indian Ocean. That would be a distance of roughly 4,000 kilometers from Iran. In other words, a target that is approximately double the range that the regime has been claiming as its limit. And this isn't just a hypothetical, it's an actual event that took place that demonstrates that the declared limitation by the regime is not in fact real. So at this point, we're left with a very simple conclusion, which is that the regime, again, has been misrepresenting its missile capabilities. Now, for many Americans, the entire debate right now is built on the assumption that the regime's statements about its intentions and its nuclear program, including those limitations, can be taken at least partially at face value. But if the regime is not being honest about something as measurable as missile range for their ballistic missile programs, this raises an obvious question about why anyone would take the regime's word on something far more consequential, such as a nuclear program, and ideally, whether or not it intends to actually develop nuclear weapons. And this is where the argument that Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon becomes even more difficult to sustain, because it's not just contradicted by their actions, it's also contradicted by their own statements. Take a look.
ما بریم به سمت ساخت سلاح هسته‌ای و یا بسازیمش یا این سلاح رو تهیه بکنیم.
What you're seeing there is an Iranian official openly calling for building a nuclear weapon. And this is consistent with a long-standing strategy that's been observed by multiple intelligence services over the years, which is to position Iran as a threshold nuclear state, meaning a state that may not formally declare a weapon, but has developed all of the necessary components to build one and on short notice. And that brings us to the technical reality, which is perhaps the most important piece of this entire discussion. Because right now, the regime itself possesses over 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to 60%. That's 90% of the way to a nuclear weapon and enough material to produce roughly 11 nuclear bombs. Now, fun fact, civilian nuclear energy typically requires enrichment levels of under 5%, and even 20% is considered highly enriched uranium. 60% is not a normal level for any civilian purpose. And as the CIA director stated explicitly this week, there's no civilian justification for enrichment at that level. Take a look at what he had to say this week.
Yeah, much had been made by some about a fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons. Notwithstanding the fatwa, what we know, and the intelligence community is in agreement on this, is that Iran possesses at least 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to weapons grade 60%, which doesn't have a civilian use. The only use for that would be the development of nuclear weapons.
Now, what that means in practical terms is that the Islamic Republic has already completed the majority of the technical work required to produce weapons-grade material, and that the remaining step to 90% enrichment is relatively short. So again, we're being asked to accept a claim that doesn't match the evidence, which is that a country that is positioning itself one step away from weapons-grade capability has no interest in actually building a weapon. And this becomes even more difficult to defend as a position when you factor in the regime's own history.
ما اول که وارد این فعالیت هسته‌ای شدیم واقعا هدفمون ساخت بمب بود دیگه ما تعارف که نداریم.
یعنی شما میگید هدف ساخت بمب بوده واقعا؟
100%.
هدف کی این بوده یعنی
کل نظام یا همه اونایی که این فعالیت رو شروع کردن واقعا هدف ساخت بمب بود. کاری که شروع کرده بودیم و دیگه می‌خواستیم این کارو خب اینو شما اگه میتونستیم اینو حفظش کنیم و بمب آزمایش می‌کردیم کار تموم شده بود. مثل در پاکستان ما که شروع کردیم بعد تا آخرش.
حالا اینه که شما میگید میگم چون ما تا حالا رسمی خیلی نشدیم کسی این صحبت رو کنه. اینا که شما میگید تبعاتی نداره مثلا مذاکرات و اینها با عنوان بالاخره کسی که
ما توجه نداره.
با خارجی بالاخره پیدا.
The regime has also already admitted that it pursued nuclear weaponization in the past, including work on warhead design and detonation systems, which are not components of any civilian nuclear program. So when you combine that history with the current enrichment levels and continued refusal to allow inspectors from the IAEA, as the regime has done in recent years repeatedly, along with missile development that exceeds declared limits, and on top of all that, statements from officials about nuclear capability, the idea that the Islamic Republic isn't pursuing a nuclear weapon is not supported by the evidence. In fact, you'd have to be an absolute fool to believe the regime. And yet, that's exactly the argument that is now being introduced into policy discussions. Take a look at what Joe Kent, who was the counterterrorism director in the U.S. that dramatically resigned this week over the war, claiming that the war is because Israel made the U.S. get involved and even accusing Israel of responsibility for ISIS in Syria. Take a look at what he had to say about Iran obtaining nuclear weapons.
Was Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon?
No, they weren't, 3 weeks ago when this started, and they weren't in June either. I mean, the Iranians have had a religious ruling, a fatwa, against actually developing a nuclear weapon since 2004. We can tell right now that the Iranians are anything but stupid. They had the ability, I think, the brain power to actually develop one, or they could have simply traded a ton of oil with Pakistan or with someone else to actually get a nuclear weapon. They were not doing that. We had no intelligence to indicate that they were.
Okay, sure, Joe. Now, clearly, given the fact he's a guest on Tucker Carlson's podcast the day he resigned, this was pre-orchestrated, or it certainly seems that way. And his claims echo the kind of grift-driven conspiracy that we've seen emerge on social media, where figures are building followings by fomenting Jew hatred, like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. This isn't about people suddenly discovering that the Islamic Republic is not a threat, and it's not evidence of some mass turn against Israel or even against long-standing security assessments. In fact, if we look at the historical record, Joe Kent himself has a long track record of both support for Israel and warning explicitly against Iranian aggression. Funny how he's changed his mind overnight. All the while, the FBI also revealed that he was under investigation for leaking classified documents prior to his resignation. Meanwhile, the conversations online are not about pursuing truth, but about frankly rewarding lunacy, extremism, and conspiratorial thinking with attention, engagement, and yes, money. And when that becomes the new incentive structure, you, of course, will see people adapt to that, including Joe Kent. Understandably, Kent is now being scrutinized for comments that have been described as both anti-Semitic and conspiratorial. Kent's own wife was killed by ISIS in Syria, a group that's part of the same broader ecosystem of terrorism in the Middle East that is very similar to what the Islamic Republic has spent decades supporting, funding, and enabling across the region. And none of that has anything to do with Israel. But that didn't stop Joe Kent from claiming that his wife was killed in a war created by Israel. Even if he was referring to the Iraq War, he would be woefully incorrect. Figures like Ariel Sharon, who were hardly dovish on security issues, opposed the Iraq War at the time, warning the U.S. about the potential strategic consequences of emboldening the Islamic Republic of Iran by bringing down Saddam Hussein. Now, Kent is simply making an obvious attempt to redirect focus away from the regime in Tehran and towards Israel. And who on earth is promoting that exact same messaging and exact same false narrative across the Western media? Oh, that's right, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, there's always been room for serious debate about policy, especially in the United States. But what we're seeing here is not serious debate, it's subversion. The question is not really what Joe Kent believes or what he believed in the past, but why the argument is being pushed at all today, given that it's frankly not supported by the evidence. And this is where the information environment becomes part of the story. When you follow how this narrative spreads, particularly after Joe Kent's statement, you see the same language, the same framing, and the same claims repeated across multiple accounts and platforms, which is how certain ideas, even when they're not supported by any evidence, become totally normalized in public discourse. Within minutes of Joe Kent's interview with Tucker Carlson, the same clips were simultaneously promoted and posted across many state media platforms like Al Jazeera, as well as the Islamic Republic's state media network, as well as known anti-Semitic influencers like Jackson Hinkle and others. So again, I ask, who is really behind Joe Kent? When you step back and look at all of this together, the missile range discrepancy, the 60% enrichment, the history of weaponization, the statements about nuclear capability, and of course the effort to downplay all of it, the conclusion is actually very straightforward. The problem is not that we don't know what the regime is doing. The problem is that there's a growing effort to pretend that what it is doing doesn't mean what it clearly means. Now, that same pattern extends into another domain, which is energy, that's been discussed a lot this week. The same question applies here as well. What happens when a regime that can't be trusted on missiles, that can't be trusted on nuclear intent, and is also able to threaten one of the most important energy chokeholds in the whole world? Well, for our second story this week, we need to talk about oil, the Strait of Hormuz, and what is quickly becoming one of the most misguided arguments in this entire conversation, which is the idea that rising energy prices somehow prove that the current strategy is too dangerous, or that confronting the regime is a mistake or could become a mistake, because that argument doesn't just misread the situation, it fundamentally reverses cause and effect. And in doing so, it's actually rewarding the very behavior that it claims to be concerned about. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a regional issue, it's a global one, with roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passing through this narrow waterway, which means that even limited disruption has immediate consequences for global markets. And that is precisely why the Islamic Republic has consistently used this as a point of leverage, threatening closure, harassing ships, and signaling its willingness to escalate whenever it faces accountability or pressure. This is not new behavior, and it's important to understand that because the regime has been using the Strait of Hormuz as a tool of coercion for many years, including during the 2011 and 2012 crisis and in multiple incidents since, which demonstrates a consistent pattern, a consistent strategy. They do not need to fully close the Strait of Hormuz to achieve their objective. They only need to create enough uncertainty and risk to influence decision-making in Washington, in Europe, and of course across global markets. And that's exactly what we're seeing again now, where the threat itself is having an effect, with shipping disruptions and price volatility already reflecting the impact of Iranian actions and signaling. So when people point to rising oil prices as evidence that the situation is too dangerous or too costly to continue, they are identifying a real effect. But they're drawing a completely incorrect conclusion because they're treating that effect as a reason to step back rather than as proof of why this strategy of coercion must be confronted and dealt with once and for all. The moment you allow energy prices to dictate security policy, you create a perverse incentive structure in which any actor capable of disrupting energy supply gains disproportionate influence over global decisions, because you're effectively telling them that if they can move markets, they can shape policy. And that isn't a form of stability, it's a system of structural vulnerability that actually invites further escalation. We've already seen how this dynamic plays out in practice, most clearly in Europe's dependence on Russian energy, where years of assumptions about interdependence leading to stability were overturned by the reality that dependence creates leverage, and that leverage in the hands of an authoritarian state is eventually used for coercion, leaving governments with fewer options and higher costs when a crisis actually emerges. Now, the lesson from that experience is not that energy markets should drive security policy, but that allowing authoritarian regimes to hold structural power over global energy supply is itself a strategic failure. And that is exactly the risk that is now being recreated on a global scale with the Islamic Republic. And this is where some of the current policy responses need to be understood in their proper context, because there's been reporting in recent days that the United States temporarily lifted certain sanctions on Iranian oil that's already at sea in order to reduce oil prices. This is a move which has been characterized as a broad concession, but in reality, it's a limited, targeted measure that does not represent new revenue flowing into the regime, but rather a way of managing the already existing supply that's already outside of the regime's direct control. At the same time, the U.S. has been calling on other countries to join in defending and protecting the Strait of Hormuz, which is a critical step, not just in practical terms, but in strategic ones, because it also signals that the response to this kind of threat will be collective rather than individual, and that global energy infrastructure is not something that can be held hostage by a single regime. This approach is consistent with the kind of analysis put forward by national security experts, including those at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who have long argued that the Islamic Republic's use of energy, sanctions evasion, and economic pressure is part of a broader strategy of coercion, and that responding to that strategy requires maintaining pressure while also denying the regime the ability to turn global dependencies into that leverage. Because this isn't just about oil prices in the short term, it's about whether global energy supply can be used as a tool of blackmail in the long term. And those are two very, very different questions. So when people argue that this conflict is too costly because of oil, what they're really doing is focusing on the most immediate and visible cost while ignoring the much larger structural risk, which is that a regime like this can't continue to expand its capabilities, continue to develop nuclear threshold capacity, continue to extend its missile range, and at the same time use energy supply as a form of leverage against the international system. And if that model is allowed to take hold, the costs that people are worried about today, they won't disappear. They'll increase, because a regime that can successfully use threats as a disruption tool will have every incentive to use that tool more frequently and more aggressively in the future, especially with a nuclear weapon. Which is why the real question here isn't whether there's a short-term economic cost to action, but whether the long-term cost of inaction is greater. And when you look at the history, when you look at the current trajectory, and when you look at the incentives that are being created, that are on the table today, the answer to that question is quite clear. And now it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly of this week. To start, our ugly story this week goes to the Islamic Republic's execution machine, and in particular, the case of 19-year-old wrestler Saleh Mohammadi, which is not just another headline, but a very clear example of how this regime uses the death penalty as a tool of control. This week, Iran executed 3 young men arrested during the recent January protests, including Saleh Mohammadi, also Mehdi Ghassemi, and Saeed Davoudi, after convicting them of waging war against God, a charge that has become the regime's go-to legal justification for eliminating dissidents, especially when it wants to send a message quickly and publicly. According to reporting on these cases, the 3 were accused of attacking security forces during the protests, but human rights organizations note that the cases relied on forced confessions and interrogations conducted under torture, with no meaningful access to a legal defense, of course, and trials that lasted days, which should tell you everything you need to know about how these verdicts for the death penalty are produced. What makes this really disturbing is that these cases follow a very similar pattern in which confessions are extracted under torture and trials are conducted without any meaningful legal defense, meaning that verdicts are effectively predetermined, because the purpose isn't to establish guilt, but to produce an outcome that serves the regime's need for intimidation. And that's exactly what this is, because every execution is intended to signal to the public that protesting, organizing, or even being associated with dissent can result in death. Tragically, there are still many young people on death row right now, including Malika Azizi, who was arrested during the same wave of protests and is now facing execution under similarly broad and politicized charges, which means that the system that executed Saleh, Mehdi, and Saeed is not winding down, but ramping up. And that's what makes this story, despite not being a new phenomenon, so ugly. Because while the regime talks about representing the Iranian people on the international stage, it's simultaneously executing Iranian young men and women using the most extreme form of state violence to maintain control. And now our bad story this week goes to the Islamic Republic's continued missile attacks on civilian areas in Israel, which are not just an escalation, but also very clearly cross the line into war crimes. This week, a ballistic missile struck a kindergarten in Rishon LeZion in central Israel, a target that isn't military, isn't dual use, and isn't ambiguous, but a children's facility that was only empty because of timing, which is the only reason it didn't turn into a mass casualty event. At the same time, another ballistic missile barrage targeted Jerusalem, with impacts landing just 350 meters from the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is particularly absurd given that this same regime constantly claims to be the defender of that site, while firing missiles that could have destroyed it. And that contradiction matters, of course, because it exposes what this really is. It's not the defense of holy sites, it's reckless, indiscriminate fire that doesn't distinguish between military targets and some of the most sensitive civilian and religious locations in the entire world. In the south, in Dimona, a ballistic missile struck, injuring more than 50 people, including a 10-year-old child. In Arad, a missile injured more than 87 in his residential neighborhood, including a 5-year-old. And what makes this even more serious is the type of weapons being used. They're not precision strikes. The regime has been using cluster munitions, which are designed to spread sub-munitions over that wide area, as I mentioned, and are inherently indiscriminate, meaning that you should never be using these in residential areas. In fact, it's against international law. But bizarrely, it isn't stopping with Israel. The same regime has also struck civilian targets in multiple Arab states, including hits on energy infrastructure in Qatar, in an obvious attempt to expand the conflict and destabilize global markets. This is a regime that is not just fighting a war, but doing so in a way that deliberately endangers civilians, ignores basic laws of warfare, and expands the conflict beyond any single front. And that's exactly why this story isn't just bad, it's one of the clearest examples this week of how the regime operates, recklessly, hypocritically, and with total disregard for civilian life. And finally, the good this week goes to the Israeli Olympians who used their platform to speak out in support of Iranian athletes, Sagi Muki and Olympic medalist Peter Palchik. At a moment when Iranian athletes are under pressure from their own government following the debacle in Australia, where members of the Iranian women's football team were threatened for refusing to sing the regime's anthem, and in the shadow of the execution of wrestler Saleh Mohammadi, Israeli judokas Peter Palchik and Sagi Muki both publicly voiced support for Iranian athletes. Take a look at Peter's message.
An Iranian athlete was executed and he was only 19 years old. Not for something he did in sport, but because dark regime that fears courage, fears voices, and fears freedom. And where is the world while thousands are being killed under this regime? Where is the outrage? As a human, this is unbearable. It breaks my heart. It should break yours too. Silence is not an option anymore.
Now, I can't emphasize enough how meaningful these types of messages are for the Iranian people, because it just tells them that they're not alone in this struggle and that the people who they've been told are their enemies are in fact not. Elite athletes who work their whole lives are forced to throw away their dreams for something as simple as competing against an Israeli athlete. And the sporting federations do nothing. What Palchik and Muki did this week was draw a clear distinction between the regime and the people, making it clear that their issue isn't with Iranian athletes, but a system that uses sport sport as a tool of political control. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. Athletes who refuse to comply are threatened, those who speak out are punished, and in some cases, as we discussed, the consequences are far worse. So when Israeli athletes stand up and say they support their Iranian counterparts, they're not just making a symbolic gesture, they're pushing back against that system that's turned sport into an extension of state power to oppress athletes. And with that, we finish up for this week, but we'll be back next week with more updates from across the region and all the latest from the war in Iran. You can also follow our JNS Iran War Brief throughout the war with the latest updates. And as always, if you think you have a story we should cover, you can reach me on social media, Emily K. Schrader, or Emily in Tel Aviv on Instagram. Until next time, we'll see you next week on Axis of Truth on JNS.
And as Israelis continue living with missile sirens during the ongoing war with Iran, many children are still coping with the trauma of October 7th and years of terror attacks. For more than 2 decades, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund has been providing specialized therapy and support to help young victims heal. Joining us now is Chava Kleinman, Vice President of the organization, to share a little bit more. Chava, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first of us, can you tell us how the Children's Fund was established? I mean, what led to the creation of this organization?
Sure. So about over 2 decades ago, the founder and president, David Rubin, was driving from Jerusalem to his home in Shiloh and was ambushed by terrorists on the road. And he and his 3-year-old son were shot. He was shot in the leg and his 3-year-old son was shot in the head. And miraculously, they survived the attack and they're okay today. But the trauma that he saw on his son and the other children around him made him decide that we needed to do something to help the children in Israel.
And, you know, since the October 7th attacks and now, of course, with the ongoing war with Iran and the missile sirens and, you know, sounding really throughout the day and throughout the night, how has the level of trauma amongst Israeli children, you know, how has that changed?
So we've seen an incredible increase in trauma amongst children all over Israel, because this is not something that's only affecting children in a certain place, but all over the country. And we see children that don't even have time to try to heal from the trauma, because what's happening now is that it's continuous trauma. And one of the things that we know about trauma is that, you know, we try to heal trauma when there's a break in trauma, but that's not happening. So it's a completely different scene that we're seeing in children all over the country.
And can you maybe talk about some of the main projects or the therapeutic treatments that the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund provides, sort of to help children cope with these, you know, trauma, with these changes, and help sort of rebuild their sense of safety?
So because we're working with children, we need to work in very creative ways, right? You can't just sit down with a child and say, what's wrong? So we work with a number of trained therapists in very different creative therapies: music, drama, arts, small animal therapy, horseback riding therapy. So we do a lot of that kind of work. We also do group work with children in schools or in different centers or after-school activities. We try to get to wherever we can, and especially now, we have mobile therapy teams that are going out to people who can't make it to centers, whether it's evacuated families in the hotels or people who just can't leave their homes for whatever reason. So we work in those kind of ways, and also a lot of resilience programming, because also that's very important at this time.
And can you tell us a little bit about the resilience programming?
Sure. So, you know, something I always like to say is that, yes, Israelis are resilient and children are resilient, but if we don't give them the tools to help them and the support that they need, you know, they're human beings in the end. So we do a lot of, like I said, you know, group work or individual therapy, but also family therapy and also support for parents, because when you're working with children, you also need to help their parents.
Absolutely. And, you know, you spent many years working in other community roles before joining the organization. What led you to personally take on this mission?
I think over years of really working with families and children and dealing with trauma, I realized that if we don't help the future generation in not only emergency crisis healing, but long-term healing, resilience care, what is the future of our generation going to look like? What are our children going to look like? And that really just made me want to get involved and keep doing the important work that we're doing.
Well, it really is crucial and important work, especially during these times. Chava Kleinman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And so to help our children overcome the trauma of war, you can scan the QR code on your screens or visit israelchildren.org now.
Welcome to ILTV on the Hour. We're live from Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines of the region. I'm Sivan Raviv, and here's your roundup of the latest developments coming out of Israel. A combined missile and rocket attack by Iran and Hezbollah has hit northern Israel a couple of hours ago, with at least 10 impact sites reported, including a strike on the Bazan oil refinery in the Haifa area. Some injuries have been reported so far as emergency teams respond. Meanwhile, in the south, sirens continued after recent Iranian strikes, including a hit near a chemical facility in Beersheba yesterday that caused injuries but no hazardous leak, according to authorities. It's day 31 of the war with Iran, and the campaign is entering a critical phase with close coordination between U.S. Central Command and the IDF. According to reports, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper met in Israel with IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir, with talks focused on the conflict and efforts to halt Iran's weapons production. On the ground, strikes are continuing. Iranian media reports an Israeli airstrike on a petrochemical facility in Tabriz, while authorities say no hazardous materials were released. At the same time, the IDF says it carried out a wave of extensive strikes into Iran, targeting dozens of sites linked to Iran's military industry. The targets included a key ballistic missile component facility, one of only 2 in the country, along with missile engine production, drone manufacturing, weapons storage, and air defense development sites. The IDF says the strikes are part of a broader effort to systematically degrade Iran's ability to produce and deploy advanced weapons. Iranian media also reported power outages in parts of Tehran following the attacks. With just 8 days left before President Donald Trump's deadline for Iran to accept a 15-point plan, diplomacy appears stalled. The proposal remains under review in Tehran with no clear sign of a breakthrough. President Trump says a deal is still possible, but warns military options remain on the table. He also threatened in a post today that if a deal is not reached and the Straits of Hormuz not opened, the U.S. will obliterate Iran's electric plants, oil wells, and Harg Island. Harg Island is seen as a key strategic target amid the ongoing conflict and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Let's take a listen to Trump.
We've had very good negotiations today with Iran, getting a lot of the things that they should have given us a long time ago. We'll see how it works out, but they're very good, moving along very nicely. They've destroyed a lot of additional targets today. The Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, we know that. But we destroyed many targets today. It was a big day. And we are negotiating with them directly and indirectly.
Foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey are meeting in Islamabad in a bid to de-escalate the crisis, but there are no signs of direct U.S. or Iranian participation. Meanwhile, on the ground, the joint U.S.-Israel campaign has yet to force Iran to accept demands on its nuclear program or reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a key global oil route that remains blocked, driving prices sharply higher. Meanwhile, U.S. forces are building up in the region with thousands of Marines deployed, signaling preparations for possible further action. The White House says no final decision has been made, saying the military buildup is designed to give the president maximum optionality. But with U.S. forces continuing to surge into the region, including Marines and sailors aboard the USS Tripoli, the window for diplomacy appears to be rapidly closing. The IDF announced the death of 19-year-old Sergeant Liran Ben-Zion, who was killed by an anti-tank missile in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is expanding its buffer zone in Lebanon, aimed at preventing infiltrations and pushing anti-tank threats away from the border. Netanyahu says the strategy is designed to thwart the threat of invasion, part of a broader shift toward a more proactive security doctrine, including what he described as security belts inside Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. On the ground, the IDF says operations in southern Lebanon are continuing, combining ground maneuvers, airstrikes, and intelligence-led missions targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. Military sources say forces have advanced toward the Litani River, while special units and reservists are carrying out targeted strikes and foiling attacks by armed operatives. Israel says the goal is to create a deeper security perimeter and prevent future attacks. That's a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour, broadcasting live from Israel and the heart of the Middle East. We're here every hour on the hour with the latest breaking developments, in-depth reports, and exclusive insights into the stories shaping the region and the world. Stay with us throughout the day for our next edition of ILTV on the Hour. We'll be here as events continue to unfold. I'm Sivan Raviv. Thank you very much for watching.
clearly, while the frequency and intensity of these ballistic missile barrages and the number of missiles is decreasing and has decreased, what seemed to be increasing is the use of these new tactics, and in particular the cluster munitions, and possibly now they're employing even new tactics to try to get through Israel's defense systems with these larger possible munitions.
Hello and welcome to the ILTV podcast. I'm Ayan Hoffman, executive editor of ILTV, and we are so happy to have back our viewers and our listeners. Now, obviously, with the ongoing war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, we are going to continue on that subject matter. And today I have for you John Huddy, a senior correspondent for Newsmax. Welcome, John.
Well, it's good to be back.
Yeah,
it's been
for
a little
sure.
while.
You know, we brought you in the last war. Now you're here back in Israel for this war. Maybe if we didn't have any war.
Unfortunately, it always takes a war for me to come back.
That's
Hopefully
right.
that'll
Well,
change.
You know, you've been here, though, now for, the better part of 3 weeks or more, right? You've been covering the war day to day, in and out, seeing what's going on the ground with your own eyes.
Yes.
Where have you been? What have you seen that's been most impactful?
Well, I've seen a lot of the cluster bomb attacks. I mean, just getting here was a story in and of itself, because I was supposed to fly out February 29th. And I would have flown that Friday, but I had to get an emergency passport, so I woke up the next morning. I said, well, I guess I'm not flying at all. Right. So I had to go. I had to take a flight from Miami, where I live in South Florida, through London Heathrow to Cairo to Sharm el-Sheikh, then to Taba across. So that was just a hop, a skip, and a jump to get here. But I made it here, and then sure enough, as soon as I got here, that's when not only the Iranian ballistic missile barrages continued, but the cluster munitions. So I've been on the scene of some of those attacks in Ramat Gan when the elderly couple was killed, and that same day, as I was reporting, another cluster bomb dropped just around the corner, as you're aware. So seen the missile impacts, the different strikes, and that and just daily life, people carrying on with their daily life amid the sirens and the alerts, but trying to just trudge ahead during a difficult time.
Yeah, 100%. And I know you're sitting in on the IDF briefings. You're hearing what's being said behind the scenes, going out to these scenes of the rocket fire.
Right.
Bottom line, I mean, just even in this, last several days, we've had the attacks in Arad and Dimona, huge ballistic missiles, hundreds injured. We've had attacks in Tel Aviv, large fires, injuries happening in those scenes. Are we winning the war from your perspective?
Depends what war. Right. So
Break
you have the military campaign, and I think yes, we being the United States and Israel are completing objectives of degrading Iran's military capabilities and certainly their ballistic missile launching capabilities. It's not eliminated, as we've seen. So as far as a military objective, it looks like we are accomplishing those goals, right? But then there's the propaganda war. There's that other front, right? You've often heard, and your viewers and listeners have probably heard about the 7th Front War. Then there's the 8th Front. We've talked about this. Yeah. That's the information war. So, and that's a question that I asked the Prime Minister the last time I was here. Is Israel winning? He said, no, I don't think we are, honestly. So, I mean, that's up for debate. I don't have an answer to that. But as far as the military objectives, it seems that way, but then there's the day after, the end game, and what is that goal, and what does that look like?
And certainly we've heard the Prime Minister and the President of the United States both speak about the idea of regime change in Iran. Not that they're going to bring about regime change, but that they're going to prepare the country so the people can bring about regime change. Do you believe that's going to happen? Because I think there's a lot of question marks around it.
Well, that is, I think, the fundamental question, right? I mean, what is the end game? Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about a ground component, right? And that, in order to enact regime change in Iran, some speculated that means ground troops, maybe U.S. ground troops to secure the enriched uranium. But, this is a question, and the question that I've had, and this is a question even after the attacks on October 7th, quick story, and I think I've told you this story, myself and other members of the foreign press, and you included, I believe, in Israeli media, were taken, we were taken to a base in central Israel to see the 43 excruciating minutes of the raw Hamas body cam footage. Afterwards, we had a Q&A session with Brigadier General Mickey Edelstein. And the question, my turn came, I raised my hand, and I said, the IDF's goal is clear, to destroy Hamas's military capabilities. But how do you destroy the radical Islamist ideology that has fueled Hamas, Hezbollah, and really, and I didn't ask about Iran, but that's what I was leading to, the rise of the Islamic regime. That's the harder fight. That's the tougher battle. How do you win the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the people so that they can enact a change and take back their country? I think that's a fight and that's a battle that's going to last years, even after the military campaign is done. To me, that's the crucial question.
You know, John, in Israel, there's a word, it's called seviv. It's like a round, right? We have several sevivs of escalation. So we go and we fight Hamas, we pull out, we get a couple of years of quiet, we go back, we fight Hamas again. Do you think then, based on what you just said, that if it's going to take years for the hearts and minds to change, for the regime to fall,
if they do,
if they even do, that despite our military successes now, you know, if we take out, we said it, I think recently, 70% of the ballistic missile launchers, okay, so
that's the estimate,
that's the estimate right now. That still leaves them quite a number of launchers, but let's just say we get it down to 90%. But then if it's a seviv, if it's a round between the, you know, the 90 that are taken out and the other 25% that they reconstitute, won't we be back in the same place if we don't have this regime change?
Well, I hope not. I mean, I think the goal ultimately from a military objective is to degrade the IRGC and Iran's capability so they don't have the ability, at least for the next 10, 15, 20 years, to launch any type of attack on, you know, their neighbors, but specifically on Israel, and to put Iran in such a position that they don't have the ability to fund and support their terrorist proxies, notably Hezbollah and Hamas. But speaking of which, Hezbollah still has an estimated 15 to 20,000 fighters in Gaza. We're seeing that. They've been degraded severely. They've been decimated, their military capabilities, but they still have capabilities. And even now, as we speak, Hezbollah poses a continuous problem for Israel that will likely remain a battlefront and a fight after the campaign with Iran is over. Yeah. So I don't have an answer to that question. I think the military objective is to degrade their military capabilities so they can't launch attacks. But really, it comes down to the people and how do you eliminate that radical Islamist ideology, if at all.
Yeah, and it's actually quite disconcerting thinking about that, looking, you know, a year after the Hezbollah ceasefire that you mentioned, and still seeing Hezbollah continue to attack Israel day in and day out, you know, as part of this war against Iran.
Right.
John, I want to get personal for just a minute. I
Oh,
mean,
boy.
You know, you've mentioned how you've been to all of these different scenes. I know you are, you work with Newsmax. You have a wife from Israel, children that have Israeli citizenship then, I'm assuming, and you understand what's going on here. How do you separate these scenes and do your job so objectively, and I do think you do, from what you see on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I try to be objective despite my personal connection to Israel, and that's something you know, that I've talked about before. I do have a personal connection. And look, even before I married an Israeli, I lived in Israel. I worked here. I studied the region. I reported on the region. I traveled throughout the region for 4 years. So I have the background, the experience, a knowledge of the complexities. So that helps, I think, with my understanding and with my reporting and with my focus. It's hard because of my personal connection, but I think in the day-to-day covering the nuts and bolts of a military operation and a war, you know, you focus on those facts and you know, the day-to-day, the grind of the war and the information coming, and you try to ask tough questions of the IDF and Israeli leaders and U.S. officials as well, and I try to do that to the best of my ability. But it is tough, you know, because I have a personal connection.
And when you go home, do you ever break down?
Do I break down, you know?
From what you've seen, I mean, I'm just
You're
thinking,
really trying to get personal.
Sorry, but I'm just thinking, I mean, you know, I know
as far as
how you feel about it. You know, I think about my own self here. I live in Israel. I have children as well. And, you know, you go to a scene and you hear, you know, in Arad or in Dimona where children are in severe condition, and you understand that a ballistic missile is fallen on this building, and it could have been your building.
Well, I've been doing this job for a long time. So I have to separate the personal from, you know, and have the tunnel vision of being in the field, focused on my job. I'll give you a story real quick.
Okay.
When I was a reporter in New York, I was a reporter in New York for about 10 years before I then came to the Middle East. This is years ago. And we were covering the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, that awful massacre where the guy went in there, opened fire, and I think it was on a first grade class. We were heading up to the scene of that. In Connecticut, and my photographer, wonderful guy, had children the same ages of those in that class, and he was breaking down in tears as we were driving, and I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, Ken, don't think about the details. Focus on the job. We have a job. Focus on the job. Do not think about those details right now. Okay, let's just do our job. Go home tonight, hug your children. Easy for me to say. At the time I was single, I don't have kids, now I do. So yes, it's hard for me to see some of those things, whether it's here in Israel, whether it was in Ukraine, covering the war in Ukraine. When I went, I was one of the first journalists into Bucha after the Russians pulled out, and there was probably a 300, 400 meter long Russian armored, brigade that was decimated, blown to pieces. And inside one of the APCs was a teddy bear, a burnt up teddy bear. And regardless of what you think of who's right, who's wrong, I immediately started thinking that probably was a father, maybe his child gave that to somebody, one of those Russian soldiers, and that has stuck with me. So as far as do I ever break down, I've had tough moments. I try to process a lot of this stuff later. And it's not really until later that some of those things come up, and that's for therapists and psychologists to work out. Not necessarily for me to break down right now, but in the moment, focused on the job. It's later when I start thinking about what I just did and what I just went through, then sometimes it becomes it wears on you a little bit, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I know they've even had studies recently about the impact, from October 7th on journalists here in the country who've been out, who've seen those videos that you talked about, been in the South and the North during this, and they're starting to see the impact, and that's really, why I ask. Now, you've actually been sent here for almost every major escalation that's happened since October 7th. Why do you keep coming back? What draws you to cover this country during wartime?
Because of my personal connection, because I love this country. I mean, I'll take my journalist hat off. I have a great respect and admiration. I love the country. I love the people. I love the culture. I love the history. I love the intersection of all the major religions, putting aside my personal connection to the country. And also, I've covered this region for as long as I have. So I do think I'm not an expert on everything, but I do have an understanding of a lot that puts me in a position as senior correspondent for my organization and as a journalist to be well equipped to be here covering these often very dynamic and complex stories. So that's what brings me back.
Now, John, we started talking about your expertise and also the kinds of munitions and the kinds of missiles that we're seeing being sent from Iran on Israel. Now, in the beginning, we saw what we saw in June. In June, we had these large ballistic missile heads that were total destruction, falling down. We had lost 28 people in that 12-day war here in the country from these direct strikes that even could get into our safe rooms, if they had a direct hit.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing something a little bit different. We're still seeing some of those size of two-decker buses, let's say, but we've also been seeing these cluster munitions, which are warheads that break apart in the sky and kind of send out these bomblets that have up to a 10-kilometer radius. And most recently, we started to see what looks like it might be a new kind of cluster munition with the same bomblets, but larger.
Yeah.
So talk to me about what's going on here and how dangerous this is.
Well, I think what we're seeing is that the Iranians are trying to employ new tactics, right? Warfare tactics and strategy to try to evade Israel's, multi-layered missile defense system. You have Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, along with U.S., THAAD, and Aegis systems, too. So I think the Iranians now, they're trying to inflict as many casualties with less that they're using at this point, and instilling as much fear, which is obviously the definition of terrorism. So the cluster munitions, when I got here, when I finally got on the ground here, I think it was March 1st, literally a day later or 2 days later, being outside, reporting live, looking over the Tel Aviv, Central Israel skyline and the interceptions, I saw the first time these cluster munitions, fanning out, as you say, over the sky, and they have a radius of about 10 kilometers, 5 miles, right, give or take. And that's when I first started seeing these cluster munitions being used. So clearly, while the frequency and intensity of these ballistic missile barrages and the number of missiles is decreasing and has decreased, what seemed to be increasing is the use of these new tactics, and in particular the cluster munitions. And possibly now they're employing even new tactics to try to get through Israel's defense systems with these larger possible munitions that are being deployed from their missiles.
Now, if it does turn out that they are able to deploy more of these larger cluster munitions, would you expect that we're going to see many more casualties in the coming days or weeks?
I hope not. I can't answer that. True. I don't know. I think one of the reasons. I mean, when you look at from a military perspective, they're not really. The Iranians aren't achieving much, right? I mean, certainly Israel and the United States, is putting them, degrading their capabilities. They're not really, when these hits are happening, it's awful, the people that are getting injured, and of course the couple that died in Ramat Gan. But fortunately, Israelis know the drill. They know the protocol, the safety protocol, to get into bomb shelters, to get into the protective spaces, and that's what they're doing. I think if people weren't, the casualty rate would be a lot higher.
And I think that's an important message for our listeners, because I think as people start to see fewer people die, they think, well, then it won't be me, and are not necessarily going to that shelter. So it is very, very important to continue to go to those shelters.
People can't let their guards down, and I need to do the same, to be honest.
Well, I didn't bring it up. I'm not going to be responsible for that part of the podcast.
I need to kind of get out, and do the same thing.
I think you were the one describing that interception overhead, so I'm assuming that means you saw it, and you were not in the shelter.
I mean, a few times I've been out there and watching and describing and then kind of scampering into, relative, cover. But I'm doing that a lot more. And certainly, after the attacks on October 7th, I was taking it more serious, because clearly, Hamas had increased its arsenal and bolstered its weaponry to attack harder and with a longer trajectory, right after Operation Protective Edge in 2014. That's one of the things that I noticed that Hamas did. They clearly bolstered their arsenal of rockets and the range and the lethality of those rockets. So I think with Iran, they're not firing as many missiles, but they're trying to employ new tactics to cause more casualties. But Israelis, again, know the drill, are adhering to the safety protocols, and should not let their guard down and continue to do that.
Now, let's talk a little bit about negotiations. We heard earlier this week that U.S. President Donald Trump claims there are negotiations going on with the Iranians to halt their nuclear program, and that maybe they'll come to some deal. He made a post on his Truth Social saying that there would be 5 days of no attacks against any of the energy infrastructure. Right. That happened, of course, on the same day, I believe, that Israel attacked some of the energy infrastructure and made a blackout, in Tehran shortly before that post came out. Now we're in a period of back and forth. What's really happening? Are there negotiations? Do you believe what we're hearing? Do you think that that America might actually stop this war earlier than later?
Well, I think it's healthy to be skeptical. I think that there's a level of skepticism here and possibly cautious optimism about that. I think probably there are talks going on. That the Iranians are denying that, calling it fake news. The Iranian parliament speaker, who is said to be leading the delegation for Iran, called it fake news and is kind of putting out that rhetoric, the fiery rhetoric that we often hear from the Iranians, more than likely because they don't want to get killed, possibly by the regime, but so I think, we'll see. I hope that that it's going in a course that will ultimately result in some kind of long-term deal that accomplishes the goals of the military objectives, which is to basically degrade and to eliminate the IRGC's military capability so they don't attack Israel, their nuclear capabilities, that they turn over the estimated 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, that's handed over, that the United States comes in, and either we take it out or they turn it over. But I'm skeptical, and I think it's okay to be skeptical. I hope it does result in a deal. But again, it gets to the main question, right, that we just tackled, and that is, what ultimately is the end game?
Right.
What do we want to accomplish?
Well, and I think that's what I was going to be my follow-up question to you, because I think the last thing you said was that the end game has to be that this regime won't be in place anymore. And if the regime is in place, if that takes a little bit longer to accomplish, as you said, they can come back and they can attack. So if we're making a deal with the current regime, then is regime change no longer a goal?
And who is leading that current regime? If it's the people that, the reports out of Iran and these people that are being taking control, because most of that senior leadership has been killed, right, and wiped out. Yes. So then then look, I mean, the U.S. track record on regime change hasn't been very good. So that's what makes me skeptical and concerning. Is hopefully this has been gamed out. I assume it has by Israel. I hope it has by the United States as far as a year to 5 years from now. After this operation, what does that look like on the ground? Who takes over? Because as history has shown, it hasn't always played in our favor, both collectively the United States, Israel, and our Western allies.
Now, if Trump decides to sign something and pull out earlier, do you think Israel can keep going?
I think Israel can keep going, but that presents a serious challenge for Israel and Israel's continued multi-front fight. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, even after, as I said, the Iranian operation and campaign wraps up, however long that takes. Now, I've heard from my sources and IDF officials it could take weeks, if not months. I heard a number out there, 6 months, possibly. I don't know that. That remains to be seen. I think Israel can, but then there continues to be these other fronts. There continues to be Hezbollah. There continues to be Hamas. And let's not forget about the West Bank. Let's not forget about some of those cells operating in Palestinian territories, Judea, Samaria, right? 100%. That's another battlefront and has been for decades. Yeah. Right?
And we've got the Houthis we didn't even mention.
And the Houthis.
Of course,
let's not forget the Houthis.
We can keep going.
Staying squeaking along in Yemen, but they still have ballistic missile capabilities as well.
For sure, for sure. Now, we're seeing some incredible coordination between Trump and Netanyahu. I think actually unprecedented, at least from what it looks like on the outside.
Definitely.
Newsmax sits in a unique position because Newsmax is quite connected to the White House, but also here in Israel really enjoys real access. So, John, from your perspective, from both of these sides, do you think that coordination is as real as it seems? And how lock in step are the president and prime minister?
Well, I think the coordination is real. The friendship is real. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And President Trump, the day after I covered the election, I was at the Trump campaign headquarters in Palm Beach and near Mar-a-Lago, and it was clear the president sent a very, very clear message the day after the election, and that is he was standing firmly with Israel. Just some of the appointments right off the bat. I think Huckabee, Ambassador Huckabee was one of his first appointments. Yeah. And Huckabee is said to be more Zionist than Zionist, even as a Christian, and he has been a long supporter and friend of Israel. And that became very abundantly clear that President Trump was standing in solidarity firmly with Israel right after the election, and then with his first appointments upon being, taking the oath of office. So I think it is real how lockstep they are as far as the operational campaign. Look, Israel has its military objectives and is following through, just like you said. Like the president said the U.S. wouldn't strike, Iranian energy assets. Well, a little different from Israel's perspective, perhaps, and even as the president is saying, we're going to see how this goes over a 5-day period. Israel's it doesn't mean airstrikes and the military campaign is over. It's ratcheting up even more on a daily basis. Israel launched another broad wave of intense strikes, and the United States to an extent too. And by the way, the U.S., as we're talking right now, still has 3 amphibious assault warships heading to the region, 2,500 Marines, and there's even now discussions about sending the 82nd Airborne and another whole contingent of several thousand soldiers to the region. So, make of that what you will, but are we in lockstep? We have very close coordination, and we're seeing that, and it's incredible. And I think the message has been sent to the world and to our adversaries, this is what we can accomplish and this is what we have. So be very careful.
Yeah. Now, speaking of these troops that you just brought up, and you mentioned before the idea of potential ground troops in Iran, do you envision at some point Israel and or the United States needing to finish off this campaign by putting troops on the ground, whether it's to support the Iranian people or to get the enriched uranium or for another objective?
Well, again, it goes back to if a deal is made, a deal, quote unquote, what that deal entails, what it looks like, the President Trump said in his remarks this week that the Iranians had agreed to 15 initial points. And, points he said 1, 2, and 3, no nuclear weapons, and to turn over the enriching uranium. And does that mean, our Delta Force goes in or possibly a joint contingent of U.S. Israeli special forces goes in and takes that out? But how do we know all of it's gone? Right? So what are the parameters here? Is it a phased deal approach, kind of what we've seen with Hamas in Gaza? Is that what's being coordinated? I don't have an answer to that. So I can't answer that question. I think the American public doesn't want boots on the ground because we've seen what that looks like in the past, and that doesn't always turn out very well.
Well, at least it didn't in the last 2 campaigns.
No, it didn't. So I don't think the American public's going to go for that. And I think the president, probably feels the pressure. And look, when it comes down to it, Americans, it's about money. It's about the economic, it's about their pocketbooks, their wallets, right?
Right.
Like what impact is it having? And if this impact, short-term pain for long-term gain. But if that short-term pain is lasting over the course of several months or the next year, that could have an impact, on public approval and disapproval of this operation and campaign. And that could have an impact on the midterm elections.
Yeah, which is really my next question. Does winning the war guarantee Trump more success in the November midterms, yes or no?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not a man. I think yes, it could. Yes. But again, what does winning the war look like? What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
If the U.S. people feel that America won the war, their pocketbooks are okay.
Things are getting better. Gas prices dropped dramatically. Yeah. We got the uranium. There's going to be peace in the Middle East.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, everybody, we're breaking bread with the Iranians. Yeah. Presumably, that could be good. But then you got a lot of other stuff happening domestically in the United States.
Right.
So, there's it's a good question. It's a tough question. I can't answer that. I think it won't hurt. I think it'll help. But if things don't go in the right direction, I think we know the answer to that.
And interesting. So I want to wrap us up, but I want to take that same question over here to Israel. As you said, you lived here in the region a long time. You lived in Israel a long time. You've been covering it. You certainly have the ear of Prime Minister Netanyahu. You interviewed him not so long ago.
I don't know if I have his ear, but...
Well, certainly you get to listen to him with that question. So maybe that's a better way to put it. Maybe he has your ear.
I'd like to think I do.
I don't know. But John, you really are familiar with what's going on here. Let's talk a little bit about the Israeli elections, because as you know, we also have to have elections sometime in 2026, October, November, most likely. So what do you think this war really means to the Prime Minister? What will the impact be of?
I think it's his legacy. That's what it means. I think it's his legacy. I think that, this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about for 47 years, right, is dealing with this Iranian threat. It all comes down to dealing with the head of the snake, the head of the octopus, whatever analogy you want to use. But you deal with the head of the snake, then you deal with its proxies. Yeah. Hopefully. Right.
Or maybe you deal with the head of the snake and the proxies disappear.
Yeah. And will that happen? Will they disappear? Will they just become political parties? There's a lot of questions. I mean, I can't predict the future, but I think that's the hope, is that the trajectory, if this goes in the right direction, could perhaps, I think the hope is that there will be sustainable peace like we've never seen. Right. And I pray to God, I pray for that. I hope that, I'm going to get emotional. Sorry. I was going to say that I hope that my children, right, who are 3 and 7 years old, are not going to be fighting in these wars. Yeah. I pray to God that they're not going to have to see what we've seen, what your country has gone through, that trauma. That they never have to experience that one day I can bring them back here and I can take them, to northern Israel, which is like one of my favorite places on earth, and go across and have, hummus in a Lebanese village or drive up the coast. I hope that we can do that. Yeah. I really, truly pray for that.
Yeah. Wow, John, it's such a beautiful vision and a great way
for us to... Sorry, I don't want to get emotional.
No. Well, you never break down. But
I feel strongly. I mean, you can see. Yeah. I really hope that they don't... there's a line that I often... This goes back to a question you asked previously about covering war. William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the great Union general, led the Union forces during our Civil War, U.S. Civil War to victory, said, he's often quoted as saying war is hell. He didn't say that. He said, war is cruelty, you cannot refine it. War is cruelty, you cannot refine it, and that's why it must be avoided at all costs, if possible. I think this is a just war. I think this was inevitable, that the United States and Israel had to take action in order to set the trajectory in a direction that there is sustainable, survivable peace. I pray to God that is where this is leading. I hope, and I believe that's the hope of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And regardless of the political ideologies and the differences on the ground here in Israel, and I mean, the United States is a whole other thing, whole other animal. But I think that's ultimately what everybody wants. Yeah. To get to that point.
Agree. All right, John, unfortunately, we are out of time. John Huddy, senior correspondent for Newsmax, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Maya. Appreciate it.
Are we heading toward the Straits of Trump? Ladies and gentlemen, let's lay something out clearly. Everyone is asking right now in Israel and in the international media, is President Trump heading toward a deal? And if he is, where does that leave Israel? And there's another question. What do the Arab states want? And are they going to join? Now let's cut through the noise and let's just add one more question. Are we really talking about the Strait of Hormuz? Or are we beginning to talk about something else? The Straits of Trump. President Trump says Iran offered him a gift, and he made it clear this is not instead of the nuclear issue. That's critical. The nuclear program is still the core issue. It is the red line, and it is the point of no return. But, and this is very important, this gift, whatever it may be enough to extend the negotiations. Because President Trump understands power. And we're going to talk about power today. And even more importantly, he understands the patience needed to project power. He knows the likelihood that the Iranian regime will actually hand over meaningful control over the Strait of Hormuz or anything even close to it is low. It's very low. But he is going to entertain it. And if what is even being hinted at is some form of influence over the straits, then we are no longer just talking about the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about the possibility of the Straits of Trump. Why? Because if he can, Trump is going to extract concessions without firing another shot. If he can do it, he will. That's how he negotiates. And it may also serve another purpose: buying time, buying precious time. Because while this idea is being discussed and while every one of the commentators is exploring and raising red flags and it's about to end, in reality, during this time, during these few days that are going by, the United States is positioning itself around the one place that actually controls the flow of the oil and gas through the Straits, Harg Island. But let's be honest, that's not the real plan. The contingency plan, and most likely the real plan, is already moving into position right now. Right now, American forces are flowing into the region. Amphibious groups, airborne units, strategic assets, including forward deployed expeditionary forces. This is not theory, this is positioning. Iran may be buying time. They might even be buying days, possibly weeks with this negotiation. But once Trump has the board set, he negotiates from overwhelming strength. The Iranians are going to look out their window and all they're going to see are American forces. Now, let's take a step back, because this discussion, as we've said many times in this war, is not only about Iran. The long-term strategic target here is China. China gets two key things from Iran. They get oil and they get gas. And a constant distraction for the United States through Iran and its proxies. Roughly 80 to 90% of Iran's export oil ends up in China. And it all moves through one place, the Strait of Hormuz, and through infrastructure like Harg Island, which is Iran's primary oil export hub. So when you hear about a gift, you got to be thinking about leverage. Because if the United States can influence that flow that goes through the Straits, it has leverage over China. And why does that matter most? Because of Taiwan. Because Taiwan is the real battlefield in the long run. Taiwan produces the semiconductors, produces the chips that power everything. It powers our nuclear submarines, it powers our missile systems, the energy grids, both in Israel and the United States, our cars, our communications, our entire modern life. If China makes a move on Taiwan, you're not looking at a regional conflict. You're looking at a global war scenario. Trump knows this, the Pentagon knows this, Rubio knows this, and Hegseth knows it. And guess what? Iran knows this as well. But here's the moment we're in. Because while China is the long-term game, right now is the moment that determines Iran's nuclear future. This is it. This is the window. And both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu understand something very simple. On the nuclear front, if the nuclear program is left intact, even partially, then this entire war becomes a strategic loss. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the 15-point plan and what this is really about. And now we're seeing what is on the table. Now, these are from foreign reports, can't verify it, but a reported U.S. 15-point proposal was delivered to Iran. Iran denies that this took place. They say there's no negotiations. The U.S. says that it was delivered. So use your best guess. It probably was delivered. And what does it include? It's not ambiguous. It includes the dismantling of all Iranian nuclear capabilities, zero enrichment, removing enriched uranium from Iran, and ending any pursuit of nuclear weapons. It also addresses the ballistic missile programs, and it ends Iran's support for their proxies across the region. It also insists and demands that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be kept open as a free maritime zone. Now, this is not a side issue. This is the heart of the war, which means it makes something very clear. This is not just about slowing Iran down. This is about rolling the program back entirely. Now, Iran's one card and why they won't give it up. The uranium stockpile is not just material. It's Iran's kryptonite. It's their leverage. It's how Iran can influence the United States, how they can influence Europe, Israel, and the Arab world. Because once they weaponize that uranium, everything changes. That is why the regime will fight to keep it, because losing it is absolute defeat for the regime, which is why this war is not ending. So let me be clear. From my perspective, I do not believe that we are nearing the end of this war, despite all of the news. There may be pauses, there might be negotiations, there might even be temporary arrangements, including around Hormuz, even what we're calling the Straits of Trump. But without dismantling the nuclear program, this is not over. So I would expect this to continue through the summer. It might be at a lower intensity, but the objective has not changed. Now, I want to talk about Europe for a moment and the theater of denial. Because what we are seeing there, it's not a surprise, but it is absolute denial. Even yesterday, a British cabinet minister stated clearly, there is no evidence that Iran can strike Europe. There's no evidence of capability and not of assessment. Now, why did they say that? Because Israel issued a warning that Iran has missiles that can reach London, Paris, and Berlin. Now, this is not an intelligence gap. Why did Israel say this? Because Iran fired missiles towards Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is the distance between Iran and Western Europe, Paris, and London. So if they're trying to hit a target, and it was on way to hit a target, before two of them were, one fell, one was intercepted, if it was on the way 4,000 miles to the east, towards Diego Garcia and U.S.-British base, it could be pointed towards the west, where it would be pointed towards Paris and London. Now, this is an absolute refusal to confront reality, and I'm sorry to hear it. It really shows the fall of those once great regimes, and this is what it means. Iran has invested for decades in missile capability, in creating heavy payloads and long ranges. We are talking about a ton to a ton and a half payload. That's a small, SUV on the end of a missile. When that lands, God forbid, the blast radius in a city center of that payload is between 100 and 200 city blocks. That's the blast radius. Now let's think of central London. Let's think of Paris. This is not theoretical. What should be done? If I were Israel's ambassador to London, I have to tell you what dawned on me. I would take a red ribbon and I would stretch it across and around central London. I would mark the blast radius and I would make people walk through it on their way to work. You got to go under the ribbon. Now you're inside the blast radius to go to your coffee shop, to get to your corporate building, to get to the British Museum. Because until they see it, and even if they see it, I'm not sure, but until they see it, they're not going to understand it. And yet, at the same time, Europe is late on the scene in this area as well. Europe is beginning to move. The UK's Royal Navy says they're now preparing to lead what is being called a Hormuz coalition. Basically, what England is planning is to send mine-clearing ships. Now, that's helpful. It's been coordinated with the United States. France is being involved. They're even going to send some autonomous naval systems without sailors aboard. Basically, you can send them down the straits and try to clear the area, and if they blow up, you realize you missed a mine. And there's over 30 nations signing on to a joint framework, and the UK is offering to host a summit to coordinate efforts to secure global shipping. So what do we see? We see they're taking baby steps in, but it's late. Even now it's late. They're stepping in while they're still in denial about the threat itself. So that's England and that's Europe. What about the Arab states? Now, are they going to join? If you ask me, they're not going to join in a major way. They haven't joined in a major way until now. Let's remember, at the beginning, the Arab states said publicly that they were not going to allow their airspace to be used for an attack on Iran. Then they allowed their airspace to be used by an attack on Iran. And then there were a few days that they were quietly behind the scenes encouraging the United States and Israel. And now they're openly encouraging the United States and Israel, particularly MBS, that says that Trump must go into the end and finish off this regime. But will they act symbolically? Yes, I think they will. Why will they act symbolically? Such as sending a missile, sending a UAV, carrying out some type of strategic strike? Because the Arab states see where this is going. And even more importantly, they see who is shaping the outcome of the Middle East. You have the little country, the little state of Israel, of 9 million people that occupies 1/5 of 1% of the Middle East, striking with equal force, along with the United States, the most powerful country in the world. And they want to be near this. Imagine playground dynamics. You want to be near the strongest kid in the playground. So what are we likely going to see? I think we'll see something visible, but very limited, something towards the end of this campaign after there's no threat, most likely from Saudi Arabia, nothing decisive. And I would imagine that it's probably not going to be sent towards the Iranian regime, but maybe towards the besieged forces, so that the Iranian regime somehow survives this. If we let them survive, Saudi Arabia can still kind of pull out that card, but something to preserve their honor, something to align with the outcome and to be seen on the right side. You know, Europe, it's the exact same story. They hesitated, they resisted, they criticized, and they withheld. Now they see the direction. Why are they getting involved? Because they don't want to be left out. There's still this remnant of the great European continent, the Europe that stood against the tyranny, at least England, of the Nazis, who fought in World War I against Germany and the Axis powers. And so they haven't lost the memory, and so they're moving. But I have to tell you, history will really remember who showed up when it mattered. Now I want to speak about one more point, and I call this the Israel paradox. Now let me leave you with this. Israel's approval in parts of the West is collapsing. Western Europe, Democrats in the United States, and even some younger Republicans. And yet, Israel is stronger than ever in the Middle East. We have stronger ties with all the Abraham Accord countries. We just signed a major economic agreement with India, the largest country in the world. We have relations with Azerbaijan, and we're strong in Central Asia. We're growing economic and military strength. Why? Why is this happening, that Israel's growing in the East and our name is being weakened in the West? Because there's an inverse relationship in the West. In the West, the stronger Israel becomes, the more parts of that progressive area in the West reject it. In parts of the West, power is seen as inherently bad, and weakness is seen as a virtue. But in the Middle East, power is understood and power is respected. So, you know, what we have is, we have the West, as long as Israel is a small country that just came out of the Holocaust, that are licking their wounds and are fighting an uphill battle, then they're pro-Israel. As soon as Israel matures into a strong country with the power to project our influence over this region, that flies against everything the progressive left is now saying, because the progressive left is built around the proposition that power is evil. Power is evil. Whether you were born into power, whether you are a person of power, whether you've achieved the wealth of power, despite the color of your skin, as soon as you develop the wealth of power, you're evil. So how can we say that Israel is developing power and doing good? Well, this is where all of the critics step in. This is why there's such a campaign right now to delegitimize Israel and to demonize Israel from people like Tucker Carlson. Because if you say that Israel now has power, clearly has power, is acting for the global good, along with the United States, that means that power can be used for good. Power is not inherently evil. And therefore, there's a real attempt right now to try to demonize Israel, to say, it's not really for good. Israel's trying to take over the world. This is part of some Jewish conspiracy, which of course it isn't. The reality is that Israel and the United States share values, that evil needs to be defeated before evil grows. And you know who knows this more than anyone else? Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer. For over a decade, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer have managed to balance both growing Israeli power in the region, developing relationships in the Middle East with the Abraham Accord countries, and even with India. When did those relationships come out? It's been repeated many times by the Prime Minister and by Ron Dermer. As soon as Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Congress and stood in front of Congress and warned the world that signing the JCPOA, the agreement that would give Iran a breakout, was possibly going to bring about the destruction of the West. As soon as he did that, he got phone calls from Arab countries in the Middle East saying, we want to be close to you. Seeing his power, saying, we want to be close to you. That's when this began. As a matter of fact, we can even give credit, possibly, to Obama and to Kerry and to people like Ben Rhodes, who, you know, these are people who were saying the whole time, We have to weaken our position in the Middle East and move towards China in the East. And as soon as the Middle Eastern countries saw that the U.S. was weakening its position in the Middle East, well, they're looking for who's the strongest guy that's going to help us. And they actually turned into an agreement towards creating relationships with Israel. So we can even trace it back to Obama, who weakened the United States position in the East, Middle East, which scared the Arab countries, which caused them to gravitate closer to Israel, and of course, to President Trump, who projects power. And so already in the mid-2010s, 12s, 14s, and 16s, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Ron Dermer were already in discussions at this time about how to shore up this region. And, I often hear people say, you know what, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Ron Dermer, they've ruined our relationship with the left. It's just simply not true. It's what we say in Yiddish is bubkiss. Why is that not true? Because they're aware of the trends in the East where Israel needs to be strong to shore up those relationships. And they're aware of the division today in the West. And I think the West is no longer a term that we can use because there are factions in the West. There's Europe, there is the Republican Party, and then there is much of the Democratic Party. Western Europe and the Democratic Party do not respect Israel's strength, and they weren't going to respect Israel's strength whatsoever. However, the East and the vast majority of the Republican Party do respect Israel's strength. And so, seeing where things are headed, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer acted early with Republicans to shore up that support in the United States. Meanwhile, the Democrats and the progressive left were heading downstream away from Israel in any case. By acting at that time and not trying to kowtow to the progressives, which would have meant a weak Israel, they moved on a strong Israel, knowing it would keep us strong in the East and shoring up the real support in the West. So any idea that they in any way damaged what was a sinking ship of democratic support for Israel is simply not true. What it did do was early in the game establish real connections with those in the West who understand the importance of strength. So here we are today. Forces are moving into position. Negotiations are playing out. There are signals that are being sent. And talk of the Straits of Trump is now on the table. But make no mistake, the stakes are enormous. What happens next is going to determine the future of the Iranian regime, the balance of power in the Middle East, and the shape of the world beyond it. This is not the end. This is the moment before the decisive phase.
At Haifa International, academic excellence isn't just a standard, it's a way of life. With 21 English-taught master's programs, world-class faculty, and Israel's top national score in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, students grow in every direction.
If you really want to challenge yourself academically, grow in a very diverse community, and be immersed in such an important and significant environment, University of Haifa is the place for you.
Located on the stunning Carmel Ridge, the Haifa blends academic excellence with a welcoming community.
Haifa International has a great combination of top-notch academics with a great community of students.
Whether you're pursuing a one-year master's or diving into research, Haifa gives you the tools, mentorship, and real-life insight to make your mark on the world. Haifa International. Master your mind, live your Israel experience.
For more than 200 years, when Israel's most vulnerable needed help, Kol El Chabad was there. When families can't afford food, when seniors are alone, when children are struggling to survive, Kol El Chabad steps in with meals, essentials, and dignity. Right now, thousands of families across Israel are counting on that help. And you can make sure it reaches them. Your donation doesn't just give charity, it gives hope, it gives strength, it saves lives. Kolel Chabad, helping Israel one life at a time. Scan the QR code on your screen and give now.
Welcome to ILTV on the Hour. We're live from Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines of the region. I'm Sivan Raviv, and here is your roundup of the latest developments coming out of Israel. A combined missile and rocket attack by Iran and Hezbollah has hit northern Israel a couple of hours ago, with at least 10 impact sites reported, including a strike on the Bazan oil refinery in the Haifa area. A few injuries were reported as emergency teams responded. Meanwhile, in the south, sirens continued after recent Iranian strikes, including a hit near a chemical facility in Beersheba yesterday that caused injuries, but no hazardous leak, according to authorities. We now go to our ILTV correspondent, Devo Klein, for the latest updates on the ground.
Hey Sivan, just coming on for a brief update on the incoming situation here in Israel. Now, in the last 2 hours, the north of Israel was subject to a coordinated attack by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the Islamic regime in Iran. Of course, the Islamic regime are sending over their ballistic missiles, and Hezbollah are contributing through their rockets and their mortars and targeting northern Israel. Now, in this latest barrage just 2 hours ago, it was the Haifa Bay area that was targeted, more specifically the Haifa refinery, and we're now hearing that there was a hit. So this is actually the second time since the war begun that the Haifa refinery has been targeted and hit by the Islamic regime. Thankfully, we're not hearing of any significant damages to this refinery site, and also personnel have been evacuated adequately, which means that we're also not hearing of any injuries to personnel. But what we are hearing of is at least 10 impact sites across northern Israel. As this missile was heading over to the Haifa Bay area, fragments and shrapnel were falling down on civilian areas. We're hearing of one impact site to a civilian building in Shifra, which is in northern Israel, and at least 10 other impact sites. Thankfully, by God's good graces, we're not hearing of any significant injuries to people, although there is extensive damage to property, to cars, to buildings, and this is in the latest barrage of the last 2 hours. But of the last 24 hours, Sivan, the north of Israel has been suffering from numerous red alert sirens. We've counted at least 12. Now, 60% of these are actually from UAV infiltrations, that's unmanned aerial vehicles. The north of Israel is currently described as the confrontation line. That means that they are right at the border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and the IDF are currently working to expand a buffer zone to create, a larger distance between Hezbollah and the citizens of northern Israel, giving them more time to get to their shelters. As of right now, there's barely any time between the red alert siren and the actual impact of the rockets being sent over by Hezbollah. So the IDF are working on it, but as of right now, northern Israel has been an incredible target for both the Islamic regime in Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and thankfully we're not hearing of any injuries as of now. But it's not just northern Israel, it's also southern Israel that has been targeted in the last 24 hours. We've counted at least 8 red alert sirens in southern Israel. That's the Negev and Beersheba region. One of the more significant impacts, and the videos surfacing online, these huge plumes of smoke, a chemical factory making agricultural products was hit in the barrage yesterday on the Beersheba and the Negev area. Now, Israeli officials are now saying that the potential biohazardous event that could have unfolded from this impact has now been deemed as safe for civilians. So that event has now been closed. And surprisingly, central Israel has not been targeted in the last 24 hours. We have had one alert in the Shfela, the lowlands region, and one in Jerusalem. But this is the latest of the incoming, and that's a wrap.
It's day 31 of the war with Iran, and the campaign is entering a critical phase with close coordination between U.S. Central Command and the IDF. According to reports, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper met in Israel with IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir, with talks focused on the conflict and efforts to halt Iran's weapons production. On the ground, strikes are continuing. Iranian media reports an Israeli strike on a petrochemical facility in Tabriz, while authorities say no hazardous materials were released. At the same time, the IDF says it carried out a wave of extensive strikes in Tehran, targeting dozens of sites linked to Iran's military industry. The targets included a key ballistic missile component facility, one of only 2 in the country, along with missile engine production, drone manufacturing, weapons storage, and air defense developments. The IDF says the strikes are part of a broader effort to systematically degrade Iran's ability to produce and deploy advanced weapons. Iranian media also reported power outages in parts of Tehran following the attacks. With just 8 days left before President Donald Trump's deadline for Iran to accept a 15-point plan, diplomacy appears stalled. The proposal remains under review in Tehran with no clear sign of a breakthrough. President Trump says a deal is still possible, but warns military options remain on the table. He also threatened in a post today that if a deal is not reached and the Straits of Hormuz are not opened, the U.S. will obliterate Iran's electric plants, oil wells, and take over Harg Island. Harg Island is seen as a key strategic target amid the ongoing conflict and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. As the deadline approaches, the region is bracing for either a last-minute agreement or further escalation. Let's take a listen to Trump.
We've had very good negotiations today with Iran, getting a lot of the things that they should have given us a long time ago. We'll see how it works out, but they're very good, moving along very nicely. They've destroyed a lot of additional targets today. The Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, we know that. But we destroyed many targets today. It was a big day. And we are negotiating with them directly and indirectly.
Foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey are meeting in Islamabad in a bid to de-escalate the crisis, but there are no signs of direct U.S. or Iranian participation. Here's the Pakistani foreign minister.
I briefed the visiting brother foreign ministers on the prospects of potential US-Iran talks in Islamabad. The visiting foreign ministers expressed their fullest support to this initiative. Pakistan will be honored to host and facilitate meaningful talks between the two sides in coming days for a comprehensive and lasting settlement of the ongoing conflict.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the joint U.S.-Israel campaign has yet to force Iran to accept demands on its nuclear program or reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a key global oil route that remains blocked, driving prices sharply higher. With diplomacy stalled, President Donald Trump is now considering a range of military options, including strikes on energy infrastructure and targeted operations inside Iran. Trump has even raised the possibility of targeting Harg Island, Iran's main oil export hub, calling it one of many options. Now, meanwhile, U.S. forces are building up in the region with thousands of Marines deployed, signaling preparations for possible further action. The White House says no final decision has been made, saying the military buildup is designed to give the president maximum optionality. But with U.S. forces continuing to surge into the region, including Marines and sailors aboard the USS Tripoli, the window for diplomacy appears to be rapidly closing. The IDF announced the death of 19-year-old Sergeant Liran Ben-Zion, who was killed by an anti-tank missile in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is expanding its buffer zone in Lebanon aimed at preventing infiltrations and pushing anti-tank threats away from the border. Netanyahu says the strategy is designed to thwart the threat of invasion, part of a broader shift toward a more proactive security doctrine, including what he described as security belts inside Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. On the ground, the IDF says operations in southern Lebanon are continuing, combining ground maneuvers, airstrikes, and intelligence-led missions targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. Military sources say forces have advanced toward the Litani River, while special units and reservists are carrying out targeted strikes and foiling attacks by armed operatives. Israel says the goal is to create a deeper security perimeter and prevent future attacks. Here's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said on this.
לבנון, הנחיתי עכשיו להרחיב עוד יותר את רצועת הביטחון הקיימת כדי לסכל סופית את איום הפלישה וכדי להרחיק מגבולנו את ירי טילי הנ"ט. צריך להבין שנסראללה יצר פה כוח גדול, הוא האמין שעם הכוח הזה הוא ישמיד אותנו. טוב, את נסראללה חיסלנו אלפי מחבלים של חיזבאללה, וחיסלנו מעל הכל את האיום העצום של 150,000 טילים ורקטות שנועדו להחריב את ערי ישראל. אבל עדיין יש לחיזבאללה יכולת שיורית לשגר רקטות אלינו. ומה שדנתי היום עם המפקדים כאן, זה בדרכים להסיר גם את האיום הזה. אזרחי ישראל היקרים, אני כמובן לא יכול לשתף אתכם בדיונים הללו, אבל אני כן יכול לומר לכם שאנחנו נחושים לשנות את המצב הזה בצפון מיסודו.
And now to the budget. Israel, the Knesset has approved a record 850 billion shekel wartime budget, the largest in Israel's history, avoiding early elections for now. The measure passed 62 to 55 after a tense late-night session disrupted by missile sirens, with lawmakers voting from a fortified room. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich defended the plan, while opposition leader Yair Lapid sharply criticized it. The budget boosts defense spending while also allocating billions to social services, including ultra-Orthodox education. For now, the vote secures the government, but deep political divisions remain. As the war with Iran enters a critical phase with escalation threats and diplomacy uncertain, we're now joined by Ron Campeas, former bureau chief at the JTA. Hi, Ron.
Hi.
So, Ron, we're now more than 31 days, just about a month into this war. How close are we to a decisive moment, or are we just entering a longer phase of conflict?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a longer phase of conflict. It's not so much that the Iranians are proving more resilient than we thought. I think that there was an anticipation that they would be dug in like this, but it's that the strategic imperatives are being met in terms of decapitating the Iranian leadership, in terms of degrading Iranian military readiness. But the regime has always been so entrenched, I think, in Iran that was never going to be, one and done type of deal. This was always going to be something that was going to be long term, and you see that reflected sometimes in the varying rhetoric from Donald Trump, in which he appears to accept certain outcomes that are less than he originally projected. So I think that we're in for the long term. We're seeing the kind of resistance around the Strait of Hormuz that will be difficult to uproot without perhaps a ground presence of U.S. troops. This is and a ground presence of U.S. troops is open-ended, and itself it would likely be a signal of a long-term engagement.
Now, are the IDF and the Americans getting ready for action in the Straits of Hormuz? Is the IDF involved in that, or would that be an American thing?
I think that's mostly an American thing. I think that Israel, the IDF, is concentrated mostly on degrading Iranian military capabilities. The Strait of Hormuz is the kind of action that we're seeing with the deployment of, I think, 10,000 troops to the area, the deployment of American battleships to the area is something more that the Americans would handle, and it's also more of an American problem because the Strait of Hormuz is choking. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz is choking oil supplies, which is driving up gas around the world. It's driving up the price of gas here in the States, but it's also inhibiting the kind of cooperation that Trump wants from Asian allies, because much of the petroleum that comes through the Strait of Hormuz actually goes to Asia, and it's hard to get these guys on board. Trump had the Japanese Prime Minister over here recently, and he wanted her, and he praised her for agreeing to some kind of vague cooperation regarding the war with Iran. But it's hard to get for those leaders to manifest popular support when gas prices are out of control, and of course there's a lot of follow-on inflation arising from the strangulation of the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. Now, with Iran closing the strategic Strait of Hormuz, and we're also hearing about the Houthis threatening to close Bab el-Mandab, how will this affect the region and, in fact, the world?
I think it's again, it's open-ended. We're getting you're seeing it at the gas stations here in the States, where prices are rising by a third. They went up from I think close to $3 before this war started, and now it's $4 or $5, depending on where you are. They're even reaching $7 a gallon. That kind of inflation is has a deep impact, and it's not just again, like, it's not just the cost it imposes on getting from point A to point B with your vehicle, especially in America, which is such a car-oriented country. It's also there's follow-on effects on the necessary components for certain high-tech things that come out of the fields in Qatar and other countries.
Now, the Americans don't tolerate very well ground invasions into foreign countries that are far away from the U.S. How are the Americans reacting to this war?
It's still tremendously unpopular. It's and that's despite its successes, and I think that's partly a function of it not being well, like you say, you're right. The Americans do not want ground invasions. After the experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a resistance to that, a natural resistance to that, but also it's been abetted by the lack of explanation of what or the lack of a clear explanation of what the war's outcomes are supposed to be by the Trump administration. Trump, famously launched this war with a pre-recorded video broadcast at 2:30 in the morning. Previously, any type of military action, not just not just a war, but any type of military action, you'd get the president speaking live, explaining what the outcomes he wanted, and calling on Americans to support the war. This has not been handled in a clear or clarifying way, and I think that's been made it a hard sell for the American people.
It's also a very controversial president who is very unpredictable. Are the Americans afraid of another Vietnam, or is it another Iraq or Afghanistan?
I think Vietnam is kind of fading from memory. I don't know if Americans believe. I don't think Americans are at the point where they think they're going to be in for I think it was a 13-year conflict in Vietnam. That was a really long one. Although, Afghanistan was actually the longest war that America engaged in. It has engaged in. So, in that sense, yeah, I think it's not so much Vietnam, because Vietnam involved the draft, and it was a whole of society involvement and whole of society suffering because of the draft. It was a little more remote in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was still felt. It was still tremendous. They still ended up both starting out being popular and ended up being unpopular because the young people, young volunteers were being committed to a war and dying in a war that after a while nobody understood what the outcome was supposed to be in both cases. And here, there's the additional crippling effect of there wasn't popular support for this war from the outset, as there had been with the Iraq and Afghanistan. So yeah, I think that people here do fear another Iraq and Afghanistan.
Now, what about the Jewish communities in America? What would you say is the general feeling among these communities?
It's ever since October the 7th, Jews here have been caught in a vice between being a kind of naturally more progressive constituency and not being on board with almost anything that Trump wants, and the anti-Semitism on the left. A poll just came out of American Jews, and it had a funny way of assessing where they were on this issue by asking them, what do you think is going to come up at the Seder this week? And so the results, though, showed that 2/3 of American Jews oppose the war as it's currently fought, but there's also concerns about how political forces that are hostile to Jews in America are weaponizing the war and making it increasingly uncomfortable to be Jewish. And so you have, the Michigan incident where somebody attempted to blow up a synagogue when there were like 100 or 140 preschoolers in the synagogue. Thank God nobody but the assailant and one security guard were hurt. The assailant was killed and the security guard was injured. But that kind of thing, really, that identification of Jews with this war, the blaming, the tendency among some on the left and some on the right as well, actually, to blame this war entirely on Netanyahu and on Israel and by an extension by the Jews, it puts the Jews in a hard place. So I would say, like, the sentiment to me, from what I've been reading recently, especially with this poll, is that there's opposition to the war, but there's also concern about how people that the Jews would have considered once to be allies are handling their opposition to the war.
Mm-hmm. Now, does this put the Jews in a tough spot, being in America at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. It's. I mean, you're in a tough spot because you're facing hostility from anti-Semitic forces on the left and on the right that are identifying you with the war. You're in a tough spot also because it's your inclination among the majority of Jews to oppose the presidency of Donald Trump, to oppose the war, as we've seen. Like I said, 2/3 of American Jews in this poll oppose the war as it's currently being fought. And when you want to oppose something, you want to seek out allies to join with to oppose. And that's hard. And so you had this situation in New York. It's hard to say from a distance. I was at the No Kings protests. There was last Saturday where there was across the country there were No Kings protests. That's what's become the name of the movement that is opposing Donald Trump. And so you had No Kings protests in New York. At least a sector of them were conflating Trump with anti-Zionism, opposing Trump with anti-Zionism. And, you're a Jew, you want to go out and protest. You feel a solidarity with people who are protesting, let's say, against the enforcement of the immigration authorities. And you go there and you hear people spouting anti-Zionism and identifying with Nazis and things like that. And that makes it very uncomfortable. So, yeah, you're definitely, the Jews are in a tough spot in that case.
Tough situation. Ron Campeas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
As the war with Iran unfolds, we now turn to Shaparak Saleh, attorney at the court, co-founder of Fam, Azadi, and Vakilan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So you are an Iranian activist currently based in Paris. How do you see this moment in Iran's history?
I think this is a turning point in Iran's history. It's something that Iranians really asked for after the terrible massacres that took place on the 8th and 9th of January. As you know, Iranians took the streets in Iran to protest against the regime, and they were massacred. We're talking about over 40,000 deaths and, terrible conditions ensuing from those protests, like death penalties, executions, torture, missing people, missing bodies, missing uteruses in women's bodies. I mean, it seems like there's no limit to the horror of which this regime is capable of. And so because they felt like they would not be able to defeat the regime alone, Iranians called for help. They called for help from Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, knowing that they were the two leaders who would be able to respond to this cry for help. Mm-hmm. And now a response has been given, and they are waiting patiently for this to result in the circumstances that will then enable them to rise again and finalize the regime's fall.
It was absolutely tragic what you're talking about. And at the moment, we are 1 month into this war that both Netanyahu and Trump waged together on the Iranian regime. Yet we still don't know if we're heading towards an expansion of the war or towards the halting of the war and talks and negotiations for a deal. What are your feelings about the direction of this war, or where it should go according to you?
Well, I mean, in our opinion as Iranians, we do not want a further deal with this regime. I mean, it's clear now to everyone how cruel and also powerful this regime is. That's why it's been able to stay for 47 years, despite the fact that it has no popularity whatsoever in Iran. And so, it is clear to all the Iranians that they want this regime to be gone. And by that, we mean for good, i.e. not a replacement of one of the current, not a replacement of Khamenei by someone else from the regime, but a real regime change. And I think it's now also clear to the entire region that they cannot have a neighbor that is so threatening and dangerous at their borders. So really, I think it's now becoming clearer to everyone that something has to be done, and something has to be done for good, that you can't sit around a table and that, the current regime is not trustworthy, and it's not someone that you can discuss with and find a deal with.
So do the people of Iran see this as a moment of fear? I mean, they are being hit very heavily as well. Or is it also a possible opportunity for change for them? Do you believe they'll go out into the streets?
So my belief is that they do see it as a moment, of course, of fear. It's never nice to be under the bombs, but even more so as a possible path towards freedom. And therefore, they're willing to endure whatever it takes to take them towards that freedom that they've been fighting for so many years. Mm-hmm. And they're waiting patiently for the conditions to be set for them to then be able to take on the streets. I think it's been clear from announcements made by Benjamin Netanyahu and Reza Pahlavi, who's the name that has been said on the streets in Iran. It has been made clear by both of them that the Iranians have to wait until they get the green light to take the streets again, because if the regime is not weak enough, then it will be more massacres, and nobody can
be safe
that.
Also.
Exactly.
For it to be safe. What are you hearing from people inside Iran? Are you able to be in touch with them, to get in touch with them?
So whenever we've been able to speak with members of our family, they of course say that they are a bit terrified, also because contrary to what's happening, for example, in Israel or in the Emirates, there is no protection that's being granted to the Iranians. As you know, the regime has been spending all its money on its proxies rather than on protecting its own people, and therefore, when there's an attack, Iranians don't have any place to go. So that, of course, is creating fear. We cannot deny it, but at the same time, there's also a lot of hope. Everybody knew, all Iranians knew, that it would not be possible to get rid of this regime without there being some casualties, and everybody was aware of that. And obviously, the goal is to have as little of those as possible.
What do you think that people around the world don't necessarily understand about the situation in Iran right now, or the situation for Iranians themselves?
I think there has probably been a lack of explanation and also a bias against those who are helping out. And I think those two things combined are creating that negative feeling towards what is happening. Iranians, for most of them, do not call this a war. They call it an intervention. So it is really perceived as a war by those who don't know much about it. And there, I think, probably, as you were saying earlier, more could have been done in terms of communication by President Trump and possibly also by Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to explain better why this was necessary and vital, why it is not just something that's happening out there, but really something that is important to preserve our world as we know it. And therefore, it's not something out there for Americans. It's really their future that is at stake.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the Iranians feel that they have support from around the world?
I do not know that. But what I do know is that they are being extremely courageous, because irrespective of the fact that it's not easy to be confronted with the present situation, whenever they can, they continue screaming at their windows, continue saying that they are thankful to Trump and also to Netanyahu, and they, they continue screaming long life to the Shah. And
well, Shabaraka, we have to end here, but I will continue by saying that you're saying it's an intervention, not a war. Shabarak Saleh, thank you very much. And that's a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour, broadcasting live from Israel and the heart of the Middle East. I'm Sivan Raviv. Thank you very much for watching.
In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to manipulate you to make a point, to show you something that has been happening to you every single day since this Iran war began, and honestly, way before that. And once you see it, you will never read the news the same way again. Here's how it works. I am going to show you a headline. This time it's from the New York Times. And I want you to notice, honestly, genuinely, just notice what conclusion you walk away with after reading it. Are you ready?